There is a story that has been floating around for decades now. Not a loud story, not the kind that gets made into blockbuster films with explosions and heroes. This one is quieter than that. It involves a Navy ship, a harbor, and an idea so strange that most people who hear it do not know whether to laugh or go very still. The year was 1943. The war was happening everywhere at once. And somewhere in all of that noise, someone may have tried something that should not have been possible, or maybe they did not. That is the part nobody can fully agree on. What we do know is that the story never quite went away. And stories that refuse to die usually have a reason. Something happened, or something was believed to have happened. Either way, it left a mark. There was a letter. That is where this whole thing starts, really. Not with a ship, not with the Navy. Not with some classified document pulled from a locked drawer in a government building. It starts with a letter written in the margins of a book, and then later in an envelope, sent to a man who studied things that most scientists did not want to touch. The year was 1955. The war had been over for a decade. People were trying to move forward, trying to build something normal out of the wreckage of what the world had been through. And in that atmosphere, a researcher named Morris K. Jessup received something in his mailbox that he probably did not expect. Jessup was not a household name. He had a background in astronomy and astrophysics. He had studied at the University of Michigan. He had done legitimate academic work. But by the mid-1950s, he had also become interested in UFOs, in unexplained aerial phenomena, in the gaps between what official science acknowledged and what people kept reporting they had seen. He had written a book about it, a book called The Case for the UFO. It was not a wild book, not by the standards of what was being published in that era. It was measured, curious, the kind of book written by someone who genuinely wanted to understand something rather than just sell a story. And then the letter arrived. It was handwritten. The handwriting was not clean or easy to read. The person who wrote it used different colored inks in different sections, as if they had picked up the pen again days or weeks later and continued without worrying much about consistency. There were underlines. There were words in capital letters. There were phrases circled or annotated in the margins of what appeared to be references to Jessup's own book. The letter was signed with a name that would later become central to this entire story, Carlos Allende, or sometimes Carl M. Allen. He used both. In the letter, Allende told Jessup that he had witnessed something during the war, something involving a Navy ship. He said the ship had been made invisible, not invisible in a metaphorical sense, not radar invisible in the way engineers talk about stealth technology. He meant physically invisible, gone from view. And then he claimed it had reappeared somewhere else, miles away, in a different harbor. Jessup did not immediately believe any of this. That is worth saying clearly. He wrote back. He asked questions. He tried to figure out who this person was and what they actually knew. The correspondence that followed was strange. Allende's responses were detailed in some places and completely evasive in others. He would answer one question and then introduce 3 new claims that were even harder to verify. He mentioned the names of sailors. He described effects on the crew that were difficult to read without feeling slightly uneasy. He talked about men going mad, men who froze in place, men who disappeared and did not come back. Jessup, to his credit, did not publish any of this immediately. He filed it away. He continued his own work, but then something else happened. In early 1957, the Office of Naval Research in Washington received an unusual package. Inside was a copy of Jessup's book, The Case for the UFO, but it was not a clean copy. It was heavily annotated. Not by one person, apparently, but by what looked like 2 or possibly 3 different people, writing in different colored inks, having what appeared to be a conversation in the margins of someone else's book. The annotations were strange. They referenced things the annotators claimed to know about naval experiments. They used terminology that was either highly technical or completely invented, and it was not always easy to tell which. They discussed concepts related to invisibility, to force fields, to what they called the Philadelphia experiment. That phrase, the Philadelphia experiment, appeared in those margins. The Naval Research Office, rather than dismissing the book entirely, did something unexpected. They contacted Jessup. They asked him to come in. They showed him the annotated copy and asked if he could identify who had written in it. Jessup looked at the handwriting. He recognized at least one of the styles. He believed it matched the letters he had received from Carlos Allende. The Navy, officially, later said that a few officers had found the book interesting enough to have a small number of copies reproduced for internal distribution. They described it as a curiosity, an informal project, nothing more than that. But the fact that the Office of Naval Research had taken enough interest in a UFO researcher's annotated book to contact the author and ask questions, that detail never fully disappeared from the story. It was not proof of anything, but it was an odd thing for a military office to do with what should have been a piece of amateur correspondence. Jessup himself seemed unsettled by the whole episode. People who knew him during that period described him as someone who was becoming increasingly preoccupied, increasingly withdrawn. He continued his research, but with a quality of unease that had not been there before. He died in 1959. His death was ruled a suicide. He was found in his car in a park in Florida, with a hose connected to the exhaust pipe. He left a note. Some people who had followed his work did not believe it was a suicide. They thought the timing was suspicious, that he had been getting too close to something. Others said that Jessup had been struggling personally for years, that his academic career had not gone the way he hoped, that there were financial and personal difficulties that had nothing to do with Navy experiments or annotated books. Both things can be true. People are complicated. Circumstances are complicated. The honest answer is that nobody outside of whatever Jessup was experiencing in those final months really knows what happened. But the story he had been handed did not die with him. What is interesting, when you sit with it, is not the dramatic version of the Philadelphia experiment. Not the version with sailors fused into the metal of the ship, or crew members going insane and setting fires in bars, or a vessel vanishing from one city and appearing in another in a matter of seconds. What is interesting is the quieter question underneath all of that. Why did a story like this take hold the way it did? There is something about the timing. 1955, when the letters began circulating, was not an innocent year in terms of what the American public knew and did not know about what their government had been doing. The Manhattan Project had only been declassified relatively recently. People had learned, sometimes in pieces and sometimes all at once, that their government had spent years developing the most destructive weapon in human history in total secrecy, and that most of the country had no idea it was happening. If that was possible, the thinking seemed to go, then what else was possible? That is not an irrational thought. It is actually a fairly reasonable response to having learned that large-scale secret programs not only exist, but can be maintained for years without public knowledge. Once you know that is possible, the category of things you are willing to believe your government might be doing in secret expands. The Philadelphia experiment landed in that expanded category. It also landed in a moment when science itself was becoming strange in ways that felt vertiginous to ordinary people. The atomic bomb had done that. It had taken physics, which most people thought of as something distant and academic, and made it suddenly, viscerally real in the worst possible way. And in the aftermath of that, people were not entirely sure anymore where the boundary was between legitimate science and something that should not be touched. Into that uncertainty came a story about a ship, a harbor, and an experiment involving forces that the human eye could not see. It fit the shape of the era. There is something else worth noting about how the story spread, which is that it spread slowly, not in a viral, instantaneous way. This was decades before the internet, before information could move across the world in seconds. The Philadelphia experiment moved through small press publications, through researchers who wrote letters to each other, through a kind of underground network of people who were interested in unexplained phenomena and who passed documents and books and copied notes back and forth. That slow movement actually gave it a different quality than modern conspiracy theories tend to have. It had time to develop texture. It had time to accumulate detail. Different people added things, questioned things, pushed back on things. By the time most people encountered the story, it already had a history of investigation behind it, even if that investigation had not produced definitive answers. And the lack of definitive answers was itself part of what kept people interested. Humans are not, despite what is sometimes assumed, primarily comforted by easy explanations. There is a part of most people that is drawn to open questions, to things that have not been settled, to the possibility that the world is stranger and more layered than the official version suggests. The Philadelphia experiment fed that part. It said something happened. It said not everything was recorded. It said there are people who know more than they are telling you, and there are people who were there and who came back changed in ways they could not describe. Whether any of that was true is a different question, but it was a story that understood something about what people needed from a mystery. Jessup's letter correspondence with Allende was eventually published in a small run. The annotated copy of the book was reproduced and distributed in limited circles. Other researchers picked up the thread. Some spent years on it. Some came away convinced that something real had been buried. Others came away convinced that Allende had fabricated most or all of it, that the annotations were his own work under different personas, that the whole thing was an elaborate piece of fiction created by a man with a restless and possibly troubled mind. Both camps made reasonable arguments. Neither fully convinced the other. That is still roughly where things stand. What we are going to do over the course of this is move through the different layers of the story without rushing toward a verdict. We are going to look at the ship. We are going to look at the science. We are going to look at Carlos Allende with some patience and try to understand who he actually was rather than who the story needed him to be. And somewhere in all of that, a slightly clearer picture might emerge. Not a complete one. This kind of story does not resolve into a complete picture, but a clearer one. That is probably the most honest thing that can be promised here, and it feels like enough. The rain outside does not care either way. It is just doing what rain does, steady and indifferent and somehow easier to breathe around than silence. We have time. The USS Eldridge was not a mysterious ship. That is the first thing worth saying about it. It was not experimental in design. It was not built in secret or commissioned under a classified program. It was a destroyer escort, which means it was built for a specific and practical wartime purpose. Destroyer escorts were convoy protection vessels. They were meant to accompany larger ships, to screen them from submarine attack, to be fast enough and armed enough to respond to threats that bigger vessels could not maneuver around quickly. The Eldridge was laid down at the Federal Shipbuilding and Drydock Company in Newark, New Jersey. Construction began in February of 1943. It was launched in July of that same year, commissioned in August. The whole process was fast, but that was not unusual. The war demanded ships at a pace that the industry had never attempted before, and shipyards across the country were working at a tempo that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. The ship was named after Lieutenant Commander John Eldridge, Jr., a Navy officer who had been killed in action. That was standard practice. Destroyer escorts were named after fallen naval personnel. There was nothing unusual about the naming, nothing unusual about the commissioning ceremony, nothing in the early records of the vessel that suggested it was anything other than what it appeared to be. It had a crew of roughly 200 men. Officers and enlisted sailors, the kind of mix you would find on any comparable vessel of that era. The crew trained together, ran exercises, went through the same preparation process that every other escort crew went through before being sent into active service. And yet this is the ship at the center of one of the most persistent unexplained stories in modern American history. So it is worth asking, before getting into the experiment itself, what was actually happening in naval research during 1943. Because the experiment, if it happened at all, did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from a context, and that context was real, documented, and in some ways nearly as strange as the legend. The Navy in the early 1940s was genuinely afraid of magnetic mines. This is important, and it does not get mentioned enough in discussions of the Philadelphia experiment. Magnetic mines were a serious problem during the Second World War. They sat on the ocean floor or floated just below the surface, and they were triggered by the magnetic signature of a passing ship. Every steel vessel has a magnetic field. It is a natural consequence of the metal it is made from, shaped and magnetized over time by the Earth's own field and by the processes of construction. And magnetic mines were designed to detect exactly that field and detonate when a ship passed close enough. The losses from magnetic mines were significant. The Navy needed a solution. The solution they developed was called degaussing. Degaussing is a real, documented, entirely unclassified process. It involves running electrical cables along the hull of a ship and passing a specific electrical current through them in a way that neutralizes or significantly reduces the ship's magnetic signature. The idea is to make the ship magnetically quieter, harder for a mine to detect, less likely to trigger the kind of detonation that could send 200 men to the bottom of the ocean. It worked. Degaussing became standard practice. Many ships during the war were fitted with degaussing equipment, and the process became routine enough that it was eventually taught as a basic naval procedure rather than treated as cutting-edge technology. The USS Eldridge was degaussed. That is in the record. Now, here is where the story begins to blur at the edges. Carlos Allende, in his letters to Jessup, claimed that the experiment he witnessed was not simple degaussing. He claimed that what was being attempted in the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard in the fall of 1943 was something far more ambitious. He claimed that the Navy, working from theoretical physics that he attributed to Albert Einstein, was attempting to use powerful electromagnetic fields not to reduce the ship's magnetic signature, but to bend light around the vessel entirely, making it optically invisible. It's undetectable not just to mines but to the human eye itself. And then he claimed it worked. And then he claimed it went wrong. The question of whether any of that is possible, even theoretically, is something we will spend real time on later. But the starting point matters. The starting point is that the Navy was genuinely, verifiably running electromagnetic experiments on ships in 1943. The starting point is that the USS Eldridge genuinely had equipment installed on it that generated significant electromagnetic fields. The starting point is that there was real science happening in that shipyard, real engineers and researchers doing real work. Allende did not invent the context. He may have wildly distorted what happened within that context, but the context itself was real. There is a document that gets referenced often in discussions of the Philadelphia experiment, and it is worth being careful about it. In the years following the initial circulation of Allen's letters and the annotated Jessup book, various researchers filed Freedom of Information Act requests with the Navy, asking for records related to the experiment. The Navy's responses were consistent. They said no such experiment had taken place. They said the USS Eldridge had never been in Philadelphia during the period in question. They pointed to the ship's deck log as evidence. The deck log is the official daily record of a ship's activities. It records position, weather, operations, personnel movements, significant events. It is a legal document. Falsifying it would be a serious offense. According to the Eldridge's deck log, the ship was not in Philadelphia in late October of 1943, which is the period Allen claimed the experiment occurred. The log places the ship elsewhere, in Norfolk, Virginia, for training exercises, at sea for shakedown runs. In various ports, but not Philadelphia during the specific window that the story requires. Researchers who believed the experiment happened argued that the log could have been altered, that classified operations sometimes generated parallel records that contradicted official ones, that the very existence of a classified experiment would necessitate some form of cover in the official documentation. Researchers who did not believe the experiment happened said that this was exactly the kind of unfalsifiable reasoning that made conspiracy theories impossible to disprove. If the evidence against the story can always be reframed as evidence of a cover-up, then the story can never be challenged by any evidence at all. Both of those positions are understandable, and both of them have a problem. The problem with the cover-up argument is that it requires a level of coordinated, sustained deception across multiple agencies, multiple record systems, and multiple decades, with essentially no leaks from anyone involved. Large-scale government deception does happen. We know that. But it is also true that large-scale deceptions tend to develop cracks over time. People talk, documents surface. Somebody always knows somebody who was there. The problem with the straightforward dismissal is that the Navy's record-keeping during the war was not perfect. That some operations were compartmentalized in ways that left gaps in official documentation, and that at least some of the crew members of the Eldridge gave accounts over the years that were harder to dismiss than the official position suggested. We will get to those accounts. They deserve their own space. For now, it is enough to sit with the ship itself, to picture it in the harbor, steel hull degaussing cables running along its length, generators humming somewhere below deck. The smell of salt water and diesel, and the particular kind of tension that lives in a wartime port where everyone knows that somewhere not far away people are dying, and the thing you are doing right now, whatever it is, either matters or it does not, and you will probably not know which until later. The Eldridge was a real ship with real men on it doing real work in a real war. What that work actually was, underneath the official version is still not entirely clear. One of the things that gets lost in the Philadelphia experiment story is how genuinely strange legitimate wartime science was, not strange in a science fiction sense. Strange in the sense that the pressure of a global war pushed research programs in directions that would have seemed irresponsible or premature in peacetime. The urgency was real. The stakes were real. And when stakes are high enough and time is short enough, the threshold for what gets attempted changes. The Manhattan Project is the obvious example. The idea of building an atomic bomb was not taken seriously by most physicists before the war. The theoretical groundwork existed, but the practical leap from theory to functioning weapon was considered so enormous that it barely registered as a near-term possibility. And then the war happened, and suddenly that leap was being attempted with the full resources of the United States government behind it, and it worked, and the world changed. But the Manhattan Project was not the only program of its kind. It was simply the most consequential and the most documented. There were other research efforts during the war that occupied similar territory, programs that pushed against the edges of what was understood, programs that failed mostly and were quietly closed, programs that produced results that were classified and have only partially surfaced in the decades since. Project MKULTRA came later, in the 1950s, but it grew from research cultures and institutional patterns that were established during the war. The willingness to experiment, to push limits, to treat human subjects and material resources as available for testing in ways that peacetime ethics would not permit, that willingness did not appear from nowhere in 1950. It had roots. The relevant question for the Eldridge is whether electromagnetic research during the war ever reached the level of ambition that Allende described. Not optical invisibility necessarily, but the broader question of whether anyone was seriously attempting to use electromagnetic fields for purposes beyond degaussing. The answer is complicated. There were researchers in the early 1940s who were genuinely interested in the relationship between electromagnetic fields and optical phenomena. The physics of light bending, of refraction, of the way electromagnetic fields interact with the propagation of light waves. These were not purely theoretical interests. Radar technology depended on understanding how electromagnetic waves behaved in the real world. Camouflage research, which was a serious military priority, touched on the optical properties of materials and surfaces in ways that occasionally intersected with electromagnetic theory. Whether any of that research was ever applied to a naval vessel in a harbor in Philadelphia is a different question, but the research culture existed, the theoretical interest existed, the institutional appetite for unusual experiments existed. There is also a smaller, more specific thing worth mentioning. In the years after the war, several physicists who had worked on various classified programs gave interviews or wrote memoirs in which they described experiments that sounded, in retrospect, surprisingly ambitious. Not invisibility experiments, nothing that dramatic. But field generation experiments, attempts to measure and manipulate the electromagnetic properties of large metal objects, research into the interaction between strong magnetic fields and the behavior of light in their immediate vicinity. None of these accounts directly corroborate the Philadelphia experiment as Allende described it. But they sketch a picture of a research environment in which the experiment, or something adjacent to it, would not have been entirely out of place. That is not confirmation, it is context, and context is not the same as proof. The ship itself was decommissioned in 1951. It was transferred to Greece under a military assistance program and served in the Hellenic Navy for decades, under a different name. It was eventually sold for scrap in the late 1990s. Before it was scrapped, there was a period in which the ship became something of a pilgrimage site for people interested in the experiment. Researchers went to look at it. Veterans gathered around it. People who had served on it or near it were interviewed on its decks. The ship sat there, aging and salt-worn, and did not offer any answers, which is of course exactly what a ship would do. At some point during that period, a group of the Eldridge's surviving crew members put together a newsletter. They had formed an association, as veterans often do, and they were in contact with each other and occasionally held reunions. And in that newsletter, they addressed the Philadelphia experiment directly. Their position was clear. They said it had not happened. They said they had been on the ship during the period in question, and nothing of the kind had occurred. They said the story was a fabrication, and they were tired of being asked about it. Some researchers took this at face value. The men who were there said it did not happen. That should probably settle it. Other researchers pointed out that if the experiment had involved classified operations, the crew would have been instructed not to discuss it. That a denial from crew members proved nothing either way, because crew members of classified programs routinely deny the existence of those programs even decades later. And here is where the research always arrives at the same impasse. The evidence for the experiment is primarily testimonial and inferential. The evidence against it is primarily documentary and testimonial, and both sides of the testimonial evidence can be questioned, and both sides of the documentary evidence can be questioned, and the questions do not resolve. What remains is the ship, or what is left of it, the harbor, the year. The war, and a story that started with a handwritten letter and never entirely stopped moving. We have not yet talked about the man who wrote that letter. Not really. We have named him. We have noted that he existed and that he made extraordinary claims. But Carlos Allende as a person, as a human being with a history and a psychology, and a set of experiences that shaped what he believed or claimed to believe, that is a different and more interesting thing to look at. And it is where we are going next. Carlos Allende was not an easy person to understand. That is probably the most honest way to begin with him, not because he was deliberately obscure, though sometimes he seemed to be. Not because his story kept changing, though it did, in small ways and sometimes in large ones. But because the more you look at him, the more he resists the simple categories that the Philadelphia experiment story tends to want to put him in. He was not obviously a liar. He was not obviously a truth teller. He was not obviously mentally ill, though some people who encountered him wondered. He was not obviously a hoaxer, though the evidence for that interpretation is stronger than the experiment's believers tend to acknowledge. He was a person. A specific, complicated, restless person who grew up in a particular place and time, and who carried something around with him for years that he could not quite put down. His real name was Carl Meredith Allen. He was born in 1925 in Springdale, Pennsylvania, a small town outside Pittsburgh. His family was ordinary in the way that most families are ordinary, which is to say they had their own particular texture of struggles and personalities and history that would not look like much from the outside, but mattered enormously to the people inside it. Allen was apparently a bright child. Teachers remembered him as someone who read widely and asked questions that did not always fit the lesson. He had an interest in science from an early age, though not the formal, institutional kind, the informal kind. The kind that lives in library books checked out and not returned on time, in experiments conducted in backyards, in a general orientation toward the world that treats everything as potentially more interesting than it first appears. He did not have a conventional education. He did not go to university. He did not follow the kind of path that would have given his later claims any institutional weight, and that absence of credentials would follow him through every subsequent attempt to be taken seriously. He joined the Merchant Marine during the war. This is documented. The Merchant Marine was not the same as the Navy. Merchant mariners were civilian sailors who transported cargo and supplies across wartime shipping lanes, often at significant personal risk. German submarines were targeting Allied supply ships throughout the Atlantic, and the work was dangerous and unglamorous, and not always properly recognized in the way that military service was. Allen served on a vessel called the SS Andrew Furuseth. It was a Liberty ship, one of the mass-produced cargo vessels that the United States built in enormous numbers during the war to keep supply lines open. He claimed that while aboard the Andrew Furuseth in October of 1943, he witnessed the USS Eldridge either vanish or appear in an extraordinary fashion. He was specific about the date. He was specific about his own location. He described looking across the water and seeing something that should not have been possible. Whether he actually saw anything, and if so what he actually saw, is the question that nobody has been able to answer definitively in the 70-plus years since. What we know about Allen's behavior in the years following the war suggests a person who was not entirely stable in the conventional sense, but who was also not simply unhinged. He moved around a lot. He did not hold steady employment for long periods. He lived in various places, sometimes with family, sometimes not. He had an intense interior life that expressed itself partly through writing, partly through the habit of annotating books he was reading in a way that went far beyond normal marginalia. The book annotation habit is worth pausing on because it turns out to be genuinely unusual. Allen did not just underline passages or write brief notes in the margins. He conducted what amounted to full conversations with texts, responding to arguments, adding information he claimed to have, connecting ideas across different books and different fields, sometimes writing so densely in the margins that the original printed text was nearly obscured. People who later examined copies of books that Allen had owned described the annotations as either fascinating or alarming, depending on their starting position. If you came to the annotations believing Allen was onto something real, they looked like the work of a restless and remarkably well-read autodidact. If you came to them skeptically, they looked like the kind of elaborate internal system that sometimes develops in people who have lost their connection to external verification. There is a version of Carlos Allende that is sympathetic. A working-class kid with a genuine scientific curiosity and no way to get it taken seriously through conventional channels, who witnessed something strange during the war and spent the rest of his life trying to get someone to believe him, and who was dismissed and ignored until the dismissal itself started to look like part of the problem. There is another version that is less sympathetic but not unkind. The person with a genuinely unusual mind who may have had experiences that felt entirely real to him, but that did not correspond to external events, who constructed an elaborate and internally consistent narrative around something that either did not happen or happened very differently from how he described it. Both of those versions are plausible, and the uncomfortable truth is that a person can be both things at once. You can have a genuine experience and misinterpret it. You can witness something real and build something false around it. You can be honest about what you believe you saw and still be wrong about what you saw. In 1956, Allende obtained a copy of Morris Jessup's book, The Case for the UFO. This is where the story enters its most documented phase. What he did with that book was extraordinary in its own way, regardless of whether anything he wrote in it was true. He read it carefully. He annotated it heavily. And then, in those annotations, he constructed what amounted to a parallel text, a running commentary that claimed to explain and expand on Jessup's theories using information Allende said he possessed from direct experience. The annotations were written in at least 2 distinct styles, possibly 3. Some researchers believed this meant multiple people had annotated the book. Others believed it was Allen writing in different registers, perhaps at different times, perhaps adopting different personas deliberately. He referred to himself in some of the annotations as one of several people who knew the truth. He used phrases that suggested a community of informed individuals, people who had witnessed things, people who understood what had really been attempted during the war. Whether that community existed or whether it was a literary device, a way of lending weight to claims that a single eccentric merchant seaman could not convincingly make alone, is not something anyone has been able to determine. What is known is that a copy of this annotated book eventually reached the Office of Naval Research, and that the Office of Naval Research did not throw it away. In 1963, something happened that complicated the hoaxer interpretation considerably. A researcher named Vincent Gaddis was working on a book about unexplained maritime events. He was trying to track down Carlos Allende and managed to make contact. What he found was not the confident, somewhat grandiose figure that the letters suggested. He found a person who seemed genuinely burdened. Not performing, not trying to sell anything. Burdened. Allende told Gaddis things that did not make his story simpler or more dramatic. He expressed doubt about some of his own memories. He said there were things he was not certain about, details that had blurred over the years. He was not the behavior of a hoaxer consolidating a fabrication. It was the behavior of someone who had lived with something for 20 years and was no longer entirely sure what was real within it. That detail is easy to overlook and probably should not be. There is also a later incident in the early 1970s when Allende apparently walked into the office of a small press that had published material about the Philadelphia experiment and announced that he had made the whole thing up. He seemed agitated. He said he wanted to set the record straight. He recanted. And then, sometime after that, he recanted the recantation. He said he had not made it up. He said he had been pressured or confused or frightened into saying that he had. Nobody who was present for either of those events left a fully reliable account of what the atmosphere was like, what Allende's state seemed to be, what might have motivated either statement. We are left with the fact that he said contradictory things at different points in his life, which tells us something about him but does not tell us clearly what. He died in 1994. He was 68 years old. He had spent the better part of his adult life attached to a story that had made him, in certain small circles, either important or infamous, and in the wider world completely unknown. Whatever he witnessed or believed he witnessed in October of 1943, he carried it until the end. That is not nothing. That is actually a significant thing about a person. The things we carry without being able to put them down tend to be the things that are most real to us, regardless of their external status. Whether what was real to Carlos Allende was real in the harbor that October, that is still the question. And we are still working toward it slowly, the way these things have to be approached if they are going to be approached honestly. The people who investigated Allende over the years came away with strikingly different impressions, and that inconsistency is itself a kind of data. Some found him charming, surprisingly well-read, capable of discussing complex scientific ideas with a fluency that seemed genuine rather than performed. He had clearly spent years thinking about physics, about electromagnetism, about the theoretical frameworks that might make something like the experiment possible. He could hold his own in conversations that most people without formal training could not have navigated. Others found him evasive in ways that went beyond the understandable evasiveness of someone who feared not being believed. He would redirect. He would introduce new information at the moment when a previous claim was being pressed too hard. He had a talent for making the conversation move in directions that were interesting enough that you forgot to push back on the thing you had been about to push back on. That talent, whether it was deliberate or instinctive, served him well for decades. It kept researchers interested. It kept the story alive. It made him difficult to dismiss completely, even when the specific claims he made were impossible to verify. There is a researcher named Robert Gorman who spent years investigating Allende and who eventually published his findings. Gorman actually lived in the same area of Pennsylvania where Allen had grown up and managed to locate family members and people who had known him personally. What he found was a portrait of a person who had struggled throughout his life with the distance between his interior sense of himself and the exterior reality of his circumstances. Allen believed, apparently from a fairly young age, that he was someone who mattered. Someone who had witnessed important things, who understood things that other people did not, who was in possession of knowledge that the world needed but was not ready to receive. That is a recognizable psychological pattern. It does not make a person a liar. Some people who hold that belief are genuinely right, but it does create a particular kind of relationship to the truth, one where the line between what is remembered and what is needed to be true becomes harder to locate over time. Gorman's conclusion was that Allen had not witnessed the Philadelphia experiment because the Philadelphia experiment had not occurred. He believed Allen had taken the real, documented phenomenon of degaussing, combined it with theoretical physics he had read about in popular science publications of the era, and constructed a narrative that explained something he may have genuinely misperceived or may have entirely invented. That conclusion is reasonable. It is well supported by the available evidence about Allen's character and history, but it is not airtight, and Gorman himself was careful not to claim that it was. The piece that keeps the door slightly open, even for skeptics who find Allende himself unconvincing, is the question of what he could not have known. Some of the details in Allende's letters and annotations referenced things that were not publicly known at the time he wrote them. Not many. Not enough to constitute proof of anything, but a few. He described specific electromagnetic phenomena in ways that aligned with research that was classified at the time and only became public later. He used terminology that was not in common circulation in the mid-1950s, but that corresponded to actual concepts in physics that were being developed in that period. Skeptics explain this by pointing to Allende's voracious and idiosyncratic reading habits. He read widely across scientific literature, including technical papers that most people would not have encountered. It is entirely possible that he encountered ideas in specialized publications and incorporated them into his narrative in ways that made his account seem prescient when it was actually just well read. Believers in the experiment explain it differently. They say Allende knew those things because he had direct experience with the research that produced them. The honest answer is that you cannot determine, from the available evidence, which explanation is correct. Both are consistent with the record. There is one more thing about Allende that feels important to mention before moving on. In his later years, he was not a happy person, not in any way that was dramatic or externally visible, just quietly not at peace. People who encountered him described someone who had the quality of a person waiting for something that was not coming, not waiting for vindication exactly, something more complicated than that. Maybe he was waiting for someone to finally see what he had seen. Maybe he was waiting to understand it himself. Maybe he was waiting for the weight of it, whatever it was, to finally lift. It did not lift. Or if it did, it happened privately, in the last years of a life that had been spent largely outside the world's attention. The story he set in motion, though, had a very different trajectory. By the time Carlos Allen died in 1994, the Philadelphia experiment had been the subject of multiple books, a feature film, a considerable body of research, and a persistent place in American popular consciousness, around the edges of what is officially acknowledged and what might have been hidden. He started something that he could not finish and could not stop. That is a strange kind of legacy, not entirely comfortable, but real in its own way, which is probably the most that can be said about most of what Carlos Allende touched. The ship was real. The harbor was real. The war was real. The letter was real. Everything else is still being sorted out, and sorting it out requires looking next at the organization that received that annotated book and did not throw it away. The United States Navy, what they said. What they did not say, and where in the space between those two things the story gets genuinely complicated. The Navy's official position on the Philadelphia experiment has always been the same. It did not happen. That is not a complicated statement. It is not hedged or qualified or delivered with the kind of careful language that official denials sometimes use when there is something being carefully avoided. It is direct. The experiment did not occur. The USS Eldridge was not in Philadelphia during the period in question. No such research program existed. The story is a fabrication built on a misunderstanding of legitimate degaussing operations and the imagination of one unreliable individual. That has been the position for decades. It was the position when researchers first started asking in the late 1950s. It was the position when Freedom of Information Act requests came in through the 1970s and 1980s. It is still the position now, and yet, the Navy's handling of inquiries about the Philadelphia experiment has not always been as clean as the official position suggests. There have been inconsistencies. Not dramatic ones, not the kind that appear in films where a government official sweats visibly and knocks over a glass of water. The quiet kind. The kind where a document says one thing and a different document says something slightly different, and the gap between them is small enough that it could be a clerical error, and large enough that it might not be. Those gaps are what serious researchers spent years examining. Not because gaps are proof of anything, but because in matters of official record, gaps have to be explained, and the explanations offered do not always fully satisfy. The ship's deck log is the starting point for any serious examination of the Navy's position. A deck log is not glamorous. It is a functional document maintained daily, recording the ship's position, weather conditions, operational status, crew movements, and any significant events. It is written in a specific format, kept according to specific regulations, and treated as a legal record of the vessel's activities. The deck log for the USS Eldridge, covering the relevant period in late 1943, places the ship in locations that are inconsistent with the Philadelphia experiment as described. The log shows the Eldridge undergoing shakedown operations, moving between ports, conducting the kind of routine early service activities that a newly commissioned vessel would be expected to carry out. It does not show the ship in Philadelphia at the time the experiment allegedly occurred. Researchers who believe the experiment happened have made two main arguments about the deck log. The first argument is alteration. If the experiment was classified, the official record would have been sanitized. Certain entries would have been changed or removed. The ship's actual movements during the critical period would have been replaced with fabricated but plausible activity. The second argument is more nuanced. It suggests that classified operations sometimes generated entirely separate records that ran parallel to official documentation. The official log would reflect the ship's cover story. The actual classified record, if it existed, would be somewhere else, possibly destroyed, possibly still classified, possibly in a filing system that has never been accessed by anyone outside the relevant agencies. The Navy's response to these arguments has been consistent. They say the log is authentic. They say it has not been altered. They say there is no parallel classified record because there was no classified operation to record. The problem is that you cannot prove a document has not been altered by examining it. Document forensics can sometimes detect alteration, but the techniques available to civilian researchers examining historical naval records are limited, and the assertion that a document is authentic, made by the institution that produced and maintained the document, is not the same as independent verification of that authenticity. This is not a uniquely suspicious situation. Official records of all kinds rest ultimately on an institutional assertion of their own integrity. We accept that assertion most of the time because the alternative, treating all official records as potentially falsified, makes coherent historical understanding impossible. But the history of the 20th century includes enough documented cases of official records being altered, destroyed, or fabricated that the assertion alone is not always sufficient. In 1978, a researcher named William Moore began a serious investigation into the Philadelphia experiment. Moore would later become a significant and somewhat controversial figure in the broader UFO research community, but at this point, he was approaching the story methodically, following documentary trails, filing information requests, interviewing people who might have relevant knowledge. Moore eventually co-authored a book on the subject with Charles Berlitz, who was already well known for his work on the Bermuda Triangle. The book, published in 1979, brought the Philadelphia experiment to a much wider audience than it had previously reached. It presented the story seriously, laid out the available evidence, and argued that something real had happened in Philadelphia in 1943, even if the full details remained unclear. The book was not a work of rigorous scholarship. It made claims that were not fully supported by the evidence it presented. It treated some testimonial accounts with more confidence than they deserved. Critics pointed these things out, and the criticisms were fair. But the book also contained material that was harder to dismiss. Moore had located individuals who claimed knowledge of naval electromagnetic research during the war. He had found documents that suggested the theoretical framework Allende described was at least being discussed in relevant scientific circles in the early 1940s. He had assembled a circumstantial case that, while not conclusive, was substantial enough that serious dismissal required more than simply repeating the official position. The Navy did not engage substantively with Moore's book. They continued to point to the deck log and to state that the experiment had not occurred. There is a specific exchange that occurred between Navy officials and civilian researchers in the early 1980s that deserves attention. A researcher filed a formal request under the Freedom of Information Act asking for all records related to electromagnetic experiments conducted on naval vessels during the Second World War, specifically including any experiments related to optical invisibility or electromagnetic field manipulation beyond standard degaussing procedures. The response acknowledged that research into electromagnetic applications for naval vessels had been conducted during the war. It confirmed that degaussing programs had been extensive and had involved experiments beyond simple hull demagnetization. It referenced several research programs by name, all of them publicly known and extensively documented. And then it said that no records existed relating to any experiment of the kind described in connection with the USS Eldridge or the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard in 1943. The careful reader will notice the specific construction of that response. It did not say no such experiments were conducted. It said no records exist relating to such experiments. Those are different statements. The absence of records and the absence of events are not the same thing. Records are destroyed. Records are lost. Records are sometimes never created for operations that were intended to remain entirely off the books. Researchers pointed this out. The Navy did not respond to the distinction. There is also the matter of what certain Navy personnel said in informal contexts over the years, separate from official statements. Several individuals who had worked in naval research during the war gave interviews or made statements at various points in the decades following in which they described the atmosphere of experimentation that existed in that period. None of them confirmed the Philadelphia experiment directly. None of them said they had personal knowledge of what happened with the Eldridge, but some of them described a research culture in which proposals that would have seemed reckless in peacetime were given serious consideration, in which the pressure to find technological advantages was intense enough that experiments were conducted on accelerated timelines with incomplete theoretical foundations, in which the distinction between legitimate research and something closer to guesswork was sometimes thinner than the official history of wartime science suggests. One retired naval officer, interviewed in the late 1970s, said something that has been quoted in various forms in subsequent discussions of the experiment. He said, and this is a paraphrase because the original interview is not fully available, that during the war there were things attempted that were never written down and never spoken of afterward, not because they were successful, but because they were embarrassing. Failures that nobody wanted on their record. Research directions that turned out to be wrong and that the people involved preferred to have simply not exist in the historical record. He was not talking specifically about the Philadelphia experiment. He was making a general observation about wartime research culture. But the observation has obvious relevance to the question of why there might be no official record of something that nevertheless happened. Experiments that fail catastrophically, that harm the people involved, that produce results too strange or too disturbing to be processed within the normal institutional framework. Those experiments have a higher probability of disappearing from the record than experiments that succeed or that fail in clean, documentable ways. If the Philadelphia experiment happened and went wrong in the ways Allende described, with crew members experiencing psychological breaks, with effects that nobody could explain or control, it would have been exactly the kind of result that an institution under wartime pressure would want to make disappear. That is not proof that it happened. It is a structural observation about why, if it happened, we would expect to find exactly what we do find, which is an official record that says nothing and a set of peripheral testimonies that say something but not clearly enough. The testimonies of the Eldridge's crew are worth examining with some care, because they have been used by both sides of this debate in ways that are not always fair to what the crew members actually said. The Veterans Association newsletter, mentioned earlier, contained statements from crew members who said the experiment had not happened. These statements were genuine. The men who signed them were real people who had served on the ship and who were, by the time they wrote, elderly veterans tired of having their service reduced to a ghost story. That is a legitimate grievance. Whatever the truth of the experiment, these were men who had done real and dangerous work during a real war, and the association of their ship with a paranormal legend was not something they welcomed. But the statements in the newsletter were general denials. They said the experiment did not happen. They did not address specific claims in detail. They did not engage with the technical arguments about what might have been attempted. They were the statements of men who wanted the story to go away, which is understandable, but which is different from a detailed technical rebuttal. Some individual crew members gave more complicated accounts in other contexts. There is at least one former crew member who, in an interview conducted in the 1990s, described unusual equipment on the ship that he had not fully understood at the time. He was not claiming that the experiment happened. He was describing something he had observed and never received a satisfactory explanation for. The equipment he described was consistent with electromagnetic field generation beyond standard degaussing requirements. He was careful. He said he did not know what the equipment was for. He said he had asked at the time and been told it was classified. He said he had not thought about it much since the war and was not sure why anyone would care now. That kind of account is actually more credible in some ways than a dramatic confirmation would be. A person constructing a story to support the experiment would have been more specific, more dramatic, more useful to the narrative. This was a person reporting a memory that had no particular meaning to him, that he was not invested in, that he offered with the vagueness of something genuinely half forgotten. It proved nothing, but it sat in a different category from the general denials. There is also the question of what happened to some of the crew members in the years following the war. Alain's original letters contained descriptions of crew members who had been psychologically devastated by the experiment, men who went mad, men who could not readjust to normal life, men who experienced episodes that nobody could explain and that their families did not know how to handle. These claims were vivid and disturbing and also completely unverifiable. Alain named no specific individuals in ways that allowed researchers to track them. The descriptions were detailed enough to feel real and vague enough to be impossible to confirm. What researchers did find, in a general sense, was that the rate of psychological difficulties among returning veterans of the Second World War was significant and largely unacknowledged in the immediate post-war period. The concept of what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder did not exist as a formal diagnosis. Men came home from combat and from service in extreme conditions and were expected to simply resume normal life. Many could not. Many struggled in ways that their families and communities did not have frameworks to understand. This means that finding veterans of any ship who had psychological difficulties after the war does not tell you anything specific about that ship. The base rate of psychological difficulty among returning veterans was high enough that any given vessel's crew would include men who struggled. But it also means that Alain's descriptions of disturbed crew members, if they were based on real observations rather than fabrications, could have multiple explanations. The experiment, if it happened, combat stress, if it did not, the particular difficulty of wartime service on a vessel that was doing unusual and classified work regardless of whether that work involved electromagnetic invisibility. The Navy's official position has remained unchanged for decades now, and at some point the consistency of that position becomes its own kind of evidence, not of truth necessarily, but of institutional commitment. Large institutions can maintain false positions for a long time. That is documented. But they tend to do so when the stakes are high enough to justify the ongoing effort. The question worth asking is whether, in 2024, the Philadelphia experiment represents stakes high enough for the Navy to continue actively maintaining a cover-up. The honest answer is probably not. If the experiment had occurred and had been covered up, the reasons for that cover-up were rooted in the specific conditions of wartime research, Cold War secrecy, and institutional protection of programs that had either failed or produced results too strange to acknowledge. Those conditions have largely passed. The war ended 80 years ago. The Cold War ended 30 years ago. The specific individuals involved are almost certainly all deceased. If the experiment happened, and there is still no acknowledgement, it is either because the cover-up has its own institutional momentum that does not require active maintenance, because the relevant records were destroyed so thoroughly that there is genuinely nothing left to declassify, or because the experiment did not happen and there is nothing to acknowledge. All three of those possibilities are consistent with the current state of the official record. What we are left with is the same impasse that has defined this story since the beginning. An official record that says one thing, a peripheral body of testimony and inference that suggests something else, and no bridge between them that holds weight. The bridge that some researchers tried to build ran through theoretical physics, through Einstein, through a concept called unified field theory that, if it had been completed and applied, might have made something like the Philadelphia experiment not just possible, but perhaps inevitable. That bridge is worth examining carefully. And that is where we are going. Albert Einstein did not want to make a ship invisible. That feels worth saying clearly before anything else, because the Philadelphia experiment story has a habit of pulling Einstein into its orbit in ways that flatten him into a supporting character in someone else's narrative. He was not that. He was one of the most consequential scientific minds in human history, working on problems of genuine complexity and depth, and the question of whether his work connects to the Philadelphia experiment requires some patience and some honesty about what he was actually doing in the 1940s. But the connection, or the possible connection, is not entirely invented. That is the uncomfortable part. There is a thread there. It is thinner than the experiment's believers suggest, and more real than its dismissers tend to acknowledge. To understand it, you have to start with what unified field theory actually is, which means stepping back a little further than most discussions of the Philadelphia experiment bother to go. Einstein published his special theory of relativity in 1905. He published his general theory of relativity in 1915. These are the works he is most remembered for, and they genuinely changed the way physics understood space, time, gravity and the structure of the universe. But Einstein was not satisfied with what he had done. He spent the last 30 years of his life, from roughly the mid-1920s until his death in 1955, working on a problem that he never solved. The problem was unification. At its core, unification is the attempt to write a single set of equations that describes all the fundamental forces of nature within one coherent mathematical framework. In Einstein's time, the two great pillars of physics were general relativity, which described gravity and the large-scale structure of spacetime, and electromagnetism, which described the behavior of electric and magnetic fields and their relationship to light. These two frameworks were extraordinarily successful within their respective domains. But they did not fit together. They used different mathematical languages. They rested on different assumptions. They produced results that were mutually inconsistent in certain limiting cases. And Einstein believed, with a conviction that never left him, that this inconsistency was not a feature of nature, but a failure of human understanding. That underneath both frameworks there was a single, unified description waiting to be found. He called this the unified field theory. Sometimes the grand unified theory. The names varied, but the ambition was constant. He worked on it for 3 decades. He produced multiple draft frameworks, each of which seemed promising, and each of which eventually revealed problems that could not be resolved. He corresponded with other physicists about it. He published papers on it that were received with respect, but also with skepticism, because the approach he was taking was increasingly at odds with the direction that the rest of physics was moving, toward quantum mechanics, toward a probabilistic description of nature that Einstein famously resisted his entire life. He died in 1955 without completing it. His unified field theory remains incomplete. Physicists are still working on versions of the same problem today, under different names and with different tools, and it remains unsolved. That is the context. Now the question is what any of this has to do with a destroyer escort in a Philadelphia harbor. The connection that Allende and subsequent researchers drew ran through a specific claim about Einstein's work in the late 1920s and early 1930s. There is a documented episode in which Einstein published a paper on unified field theory that he later withdrew. He published it, it circulated briefly, and then he pulled it back, saying that further examination had revealed problems he had not initially seen. This kind of thing happens in science. Researchers publish preliminary results and then revise them. It is not unusual, but the claim, made by Allende and developed by later researchers, was that Einstein did not withdraw the paper because it was wrong. He withdrew it because it worked. Because the implications of what the equations described were dangerous enough, or destabilizing enough, or simply too far ahead of what physics and society were prepared to handle, that publication was not responsible. This claim has no documentary support. There is no letter from Einstein saying this. There is no account from colleagues. There is no version of the story that exists in primary sources. What there is, which is somewhat more interesting, is the general fact that Einstein was acutely aware of the relationship between theoretical physics and its military applications. He had, after all, signed the letter to President Roosevelt in 1939 that helped initiate the Manhattan Project. He spent considerable time in his later years expressing regret and concern about what physics had enabled. He was not naive about the ways in which theoretical work could be translated into destructive technology. So the idea that Einstein might have withheld something because he was concerned about its implications is not psychologically implausible. It does not fit the standard narrative of how science works, where results are published and assessed by the community. But Einstein was not a standard scientist operating in standard conditions. He was a specific person with a specific set of concerns, living through a specific historical moment. None of that confirms the claim. It just makes it slightly less easy to dismiss on purely psychological grounds. The more substantive question is whether the physics underlying the claimed experiment makes any sense at all. The basic idea, as Allende described it, and as subsequent researchers elaborated it, was that sufficiently powerful electromagnetic fields could bend light around an object, rendering it optically invisible. The theoretical mechanism involved was something like the effect that general relativity predicts in the vicinity of extremely massive objects, where gravity curves space-time and therefore curves the path of light passing through it. The claim was that electromagnetic fields could produce a similar curvature effect without requiring the mass of a star. That the right configuration of fields at the right intensity could create a local distortion in the properties of space around an object that would cause light to travel around it rather than reflecting off it. This is not how electromagnetism works according to established physics. Standard electromagnetic theory, Maxwell's equations, does not predict any such effect. Light does interact with electromagnetic fields in certain quantum mechanical contexts, but those interactions do not produce the kind of macroscopic bending effect that would make a ship invisible. The unified field theory angle was meant to address this gap. If electromagnetism and gravity were actually aspects of a single unified force, described by equations that Einstein was developing but never completed, then perhaps those equations would predict interactions between electromagnetic fields and spacetime geometry that standard electromagnetism does not describe. Perhaps a sufficiently powerful electromagnetic field could, within the framework of a complete unified theory, produce gravitational-like effects on the local structure of space. This is speculative. It is more than speculative. It is extrapolating from a theoretical framework that was never completed into a regime of physical prediction that has no experimental basis to explain a claimed effect that standard physics says is impossible. But it is not entirely without logical structure. The argument is not random. It follows a chain of reasoning, and the chain, while unsupported, does not break in an immediately obvious place. That is different from most pseudoscientific claims, which tend to break fairly quickly when examined. The Philadelphia experiment physics is more like a building constructed on a foundation that does not exist. The building has internal coherence. The foundation is the problem. In the early 1940s, Einstein was at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. He had been there since 1933, having left Germany when the political situation made remaining impossible. He was working on his unified field theory. He was also, in various ways, involved with the war effort, though not in the direct manner of the Manhattan Project scientists. There is documented contact between Einstein and the Navy during this period. In 1943 and 1944, Einstein worked as a part-time consultant for the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance. His work there was related to explosives research and was apparently not connected to electromagnetic field experiments of the kind the Philadelphia experiment describes. But the documented connection exists. Einstein and the Navy were in contact during exactly the period the experiment allegedly occurred. He was in New Jersey, not far from Philadelphia. He was working on unified field theory in his private research. He was consulting for the Navy on unrelated matters. The proximity is real. The connection between the private research and the naval consultation is unsubstantiated. But the raw materials for the story are genuinely there in the historical record, and that is part of why the story has been so difficult to simply dismiss. There is a physicist named Thomas Townsend Brown, whose name comes up in certain versions of the Philadelphia experiment story, and he is worth a careful look. Brown was an American physicist who, from the 1920s onward, conducted research into what he believed was a genuine connection between electromagnetic fields and gravitational effects. He claimed to have observed, under controlled laboratory conditions, that electrically charged objects could produce thrust in a direction related to the orientation of the electric field. He called this the Biefeld-Brown effect, named after himself and a mentor. The mainstream physics community was skeptical of Brown's claims. Some of his experimental results were attributed to ionic wind, the movement of air molecules driven by the electric field, rather than any gravitational effect. The more exotic interpretation that he had discovered a genuine electromagnetic gravitational coupling was not supported by theoretical physics and was not reproducible under conditions that ruled out conventional explanations. Brown spent decades trying to get his work taken seriously. He worked for various private companies and research organizations. He had periodic contact with military research agencies. He believed until the end of his life that he had found something real. He is relevant to the Philadelphia experiment story for two reasons. First, he represents the existence of a genuine research culture, operating at the margins of mainstream physics, that was seriously investigating exactly the kind of electromagnetic gravitational coupling that the experiment's theoretical basis requires. He was not Carlos Allende. He had formal training. He had laboratory facilities. He produced documented results, even if those results were contested. Second, some researchers have suggested that Brown's work, or work similar to it, may have been the actual scientific basis for whatever was attempted with the Eldridge. Not Einstein's unified field theory exactly, but a more applied, experimental approach to the same general question of whether electromagnetic fields could produce physical effects beyond what standard theory predicted. This suggestion is circumstantial. There is no document placing Brown in connection with the Eldridge or with any naval experiment involving optical invisibility, but his existence complicates the picture of the era's physics in a useful way. It shows that the question being asked, even if asked wrongly, was being asked by people with genuine scientific backgrounds and genuine laboratory experience. The other scientific concept that appears in discussions of the Philadelphia experiment is something called the Faraday cage effect, and it is worth addressing because it is sometimes invoked in ways that are more misleading than clarifying. A Faraday cage is a mesh of conductive material that blocks external electromagnetic fields. The effect is real and well documented and has practical applications in electronics and telecommunications. A metal enclosure can shield its interior from external electromagnetic radiation. Some versions of the Philadelphia experiment story invoke the Faraday cage in reverse, suggesting that the hull of the Eldridge, energized with the right configuration of electromagnetic fields, could create an effect that bent or blocked light in the way a Faraday cage blocks radio waves. This does not work as physics. A Faraday cage does not bend light. It does not create any optical effect. Light and radio waves are both electromagnetic radiation, but they interact with matter very differently at different frequencies, and the shielding effect of a conductive enclosure at radio frequencies does not translate into any kind of optical invisibility at visible light frequencies. The people who invoke this connection are drawing an analogy that sounds plausible but does not hold up to examination, which is not unusual in discussions of the Philadelphia experiment. The story has a talent for generating arguments that feel coherent until you press them gently and they give way. What the physics discussion ultimately arrives at is something like this. The theoretical basis for the Philadelphia experiment, as it has been articulated over the decades, draws on real concepts from real physics. Unified field theory is a real research program. Electromagnetic gravitational coupling is a real theoretical question. The interaction of electromagnetic fields with the propagation of light is a real area of physics, but the specific claims made about the experiment require extrapolations from those real concepts that go far beyond what the physics supports. They require either a complete unified field theory that does not exist or experimental results that have never been reproduced or even attempted in any documented program. The honest assessment is that the physics as described does not work, not with our current understanding of nature. Not with any theoretical framework that has been tested against experiment. The more interesting question, and the one that is harder to close, is whether our current understanding of nature is complete enough to make that assessment final. Physics has been surprised before. The history of the discipline is full of cases where something that seemed impossible according to the best available theory turned out to be real. Not common, not the norm, but real enough that epistemic humility about what is and is not possible is warranted. The Philadelphia experiment physics is almost certainly wrong. The nearly is doing some work in that sentence. What Einstein was actually working on in Princeton in those years, the specific content of the equations he was developing and discarding and revising, is not fully known. His notebooks from that period are archived and have been examined by physicists who have not found anything resembling a theory of electromagnetic invisibility. But Einstein's notebooks are not the only place his ideas existed. He talked to colleagues. He corresponded widely. He thought on walks and in conversations, and in the kind of unrecorded moments that constitute most of a working scientist's intellectual life. What he knew and what he shared and what he deliberately kept to himself because he was afraid of where it led, those things are not fully recoverable. The rain keeps coming down. The harbor is dark. The ship is there or it is not there, and the equations that would tell us which have never been finished. We are still inside the question. Memory is not a recording. That is something neuroscience has established fairly clearly over the past few decades, and it matters here more than it might seem. Memory is reconstructive. Every time you remember something, you are not playing back a fixed file. You are rebuilding the event from fragments, filling gaps with inference and expectation, shaping the narrative around what you currently believe to be true. The memory you access today is slightly different from the memory you accessed last year, which was slightly different from the one you accessed the year before that. This does not mean memory is useless. It means memory is human. It means that when someone tells you what they saw or experienced 40 or 50 years ago, you are receiving something real and something altered simultaneously, and there is no clean way to separate those two things. The crew members of the USS Eldridge who spoke over the years about their experiences during the war were doing exactly what all human beings do when they reach back into the past. They were remembering, and their memories, like all memories, were both evidence and interpretation at once. What they said is worth listening to carefully, not credulously, carefully. The most commonly cited crew testimony in discussions of the Philadelphia experiment comes from a man named Alfred Bielek, and it requires immediate qualification because Bielek is a deeply problematic source. Bielek, who came to public attention in the late 1980s and early 1990s, claimed not only to have been present during the Philadelphia experiment, but to have jumped off the Eldridge during the experiment and been transported through time to the future, where he spent years before being sent back. He claimed his memories had been suppressed, and only recovered through a process of regression and research. He also claimed, at various points, to have been a different person entirely before the Navy allegedly altered his identity, and to have had a brother who was also involved in the experiment and who remained lost in time. These claims are not credible. They extend so far beyond the already extraordinary claims of the base Philadelphia experiment narrative that they collapse under their own weight. Bielek changed his story multiple times. Researchers who investigated his background found that his claimed service records did not check out. His testimony about the experiment contained internal contradictions that he could not resolve. He is mentioned here not because he is a reliable source, but because he became, unfortunately, one of the most visible voices associated with the experiment in certain popular treatments of the story. His presence in the narrative gave critics an easy target and made it harder for more measured examination of crew testimony to be taken seriously. The Bielek problem is real, and it is worth naming directly. When a story accumulates enough unreliable witnesses, the credibility of the more careful ones gets damaged by proximity. Setting Bielek aside entirely, which is the appropriate thing to do, there are other accounts from people connected to the Eldridge or to the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard during the relevant period that are quieter and harder to dismiss on the same grounds. One category of testimony comes from people who did not claim to have witnessed the experiment itself, but who described the atmosphere around the Eldridge and the shipyard in terms that suggested something unusual was being attempted. A civilian contractor who had worked at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard during the war gave an account in the 1970s that was recorded by a researcher. He said that in the fall of 1943, there was a period of unusual activity around one of the vessels in the yard. He did not know which vessel. He described heavy cables being run to it from external power sources, generators being brought in that were larger than standard equipment, and a general instruction to the civilian workforce to stay away from a particular section of the yard during certain hours. He was not claiming to have seen anything paranormal. He was describing what any alert worker would have noticed and remembered: unusual equipment, unusual restrictions, the particular quality of secrecy that descends on a place when something is being done that the people doing it do not want observed. He said he had forgotten about it for years and only connected it to the Philadelphia experiment story when he read about it in a publication sometime in the 1960s. He said when he read the description of what was supposedly attempted, he felt a recognition that he could not fully explain. That kind of testimony is simultaneously compelling and frustrating. Compelling because it is specific and unembellished. Frustrating because it cannot be verified, because the witness is describing a memory of an atmosphere rather than a memory of an event, and because the connection he drew between what he saw and the Philadelphia experiment narrative was made retrospectively, after he had already encountered that narrative. Retrospective connection is a real problem in this kind of testimony. Once you know a story, your memories of the period the story covers get reorganized around it. Things that seemed unremarkable at the time gain significance in retrospect. Things that had no meaning in the moment get recruited as evidence for a narrative that did not exist when you were living through them. This does not make the testimony worthless. It makes it impure. All testimony is impure to some degree. The question is always how impure and in what direction. There are also accounts from family members of crew members who had passed away by the time researchers were actively investigating. A woman whose father had served on the Eldridge gave an account in the late 1990s of something her father had told her once when she was a teenager, and he had been drinking more than usual one evening. She said he told her that there had been something wrong with the ship. She said his exact phrase, as she remembered it, was that the ship did things it was not supposed to do. She asked him what he meant, and he would not elaborate. He changed the subject and never brought it up again. She said he was not a dramatic man. She said he did not tell stories for effect. She said the reason she remembered the moment was precisely because it was so out of character for him, that the statement had no context in her relationship with him and no follow-up, and that it stayed with her as a thing that did not fit. Her father was dead by the time she told this story. He could not be asked about it. The account is second-hand and filtered through decades of memory and the particular emotional weight of a daughter remembering her father. But the specific quality of that account, the casual, half-suppressed nature of it, the father who said one thing and then would not say more, that has a texture that is different from the dramatic testimonies that surround so much of this story. People who are making things up tend to elaborate. People who are suppressing something tend to say less than they know. There is a sailor, not identified by name in the sources that cover him, who was described by a researcher in the early 1980s as having been interviewed at length about his service on the Eldridge. The researcher said the man had been reluctant to talk and had agreed only on the condition that he not be named. According to the researcher's account of the interview, the sailor said that during a specific period in late 1943, the crew had been given unusual instructions about the operation of certain equipment on the ship. He said he did not fully understand the equipment and had not been given a technical explanation for what it did. He said there had been an incident during which several crew members had become disoriented and confused in ways that the ship's medical personnel could not readily explain. He was careful to say that he did not know whether the disorientation was connected to the equipment. He said it might have been. He said the timing was close enough that some of the crew had made the connection themselves at the time, though nobody spoke about it officially. He described the disorientation as lasting hours in some cases. He described men who seemed not to know where they were or what they were doing, who had to be guided to their bunks and who recovered slowly. He said it was different from seasickness and different from the effects of alcohol and different from the kind of exhaustion that comes from too many consecutive hours on watch. He said he had not spoken about it in the years since because he had been told not to, and because he was not sure what had caused it, and because the whole period had a quality of strangeness that he found easier not to revisit. The researcher who conducted this interview maintained that the sailor was credible, specific, and not interested in fame or attention. The interview was never made fully public in a way that allowed independent assessment, which is the problem with so much of the testimony surrounding this story. It exists in forms that are not fully accessible, summaries of interviews rather than transcripts, accounts of conversations rather than recordings, the original source always one step removed from the researcher reporting it. What would it actually feel like to be on a ship during a powerful electromagnetic experiment? This is not a hypothetical question in the way it might seem. There is documented research on the physiological effects of strong electromagnetic fields on human beings, and some of what that research describes is relevant to the accounts given by people connected to the Eldridge. Strong magnetic fields can cause sensory disturbances in humans. This is well established. People exposed to strong magnetic fields have reported visual disturbances, including the perception of flashes of light or unusual visual phenomena. They have reported disorientation, difficulty with spatial perception, a sense of confusion or unreality. Some have reported nausea and difficulty maintaining balance. These effects are most pronounced with extremely strong fields, significantly stronger than what standard degaussing equipment would produce. But the degaussing equipment on a ship like the Eldridge was not standard by peacetime standards. It was wartime equipment, built for effectiveness rather than for careful calibration of human exposure limits. If the equipment on the Eldridge was operating at unusual power levels, whether as part of an experiment or simply because the wartime version of degaussing pushed harder than peacetime procedures would have permitted, some of the physiological effects described in crew accounts are not implausible on purely electromagnetic grounds. That is not confirmation of the experiment. It is a bridge between the documented science of electromagnetic effects on humans and the reported experiences of people who were on the ship. The gap between that bridge and the claim of optical invisibility remains enormous. Electromagnetic fields that cause sensory disturbances in nearby humans do not thereby make the vessel producing them invisible. The physiological effects and the claimed optical effects are entirely separate phenomena, and demonstrating the plausibility of one does nothing to establish the plausibility of the other. But the accounts of crew members who described disorientation and confusion without being able to explain it are not, on this basis, entirely without a natural explanation. They may describe real experiences that had entirely conventional causes. There is one more category of testimony worth considering, and it is the most uncomfortable one. Several of the Eldridge crew members who engaged with researchers over the years described not specific incidents or observations, but a general reluctance to discuss the ship at all. Not the specific reluctance of someone who was told not to talk, something more fundamental than that. The reluctance of someone for whom the whole period carries an emotional weight that they would rather not disturb. Veterans carry difficult things. That is simply true. The Second World War produced experiences that a significant percentage of its participants never fully processed or discussed. The reluctance to revisit certain periods is common and has many causes that have nothing to do with any specific experiment. But the quality of reluctance that some researchers described encountering in crew members of the Eldridge had a specific flavor, not the reluctance of combat trauma, which tends to have a different emotional signature. Something more like the reluctance of someone who is not sure what they remember and is afraid that examining it too closely might not clarify it, but might instead make it stranger. That is a precise and unusual thing to describe. It is not the kind of thing that gets invented easily. It is the kind of thing that either comes from genuine experience or from a researcher who was projecting their own expectations onto the behavior of the people they interviewed. Both are possible. And again, there is no clean way to separate them from the available record. What remains is a collection of voices, most of them fragmented, some of them unreliable, a few of them carrying something that feels like genuine memory of something genuinely unusual. Assembled over decades by researchers who were not always rigorous and not always honest, but who were most of them trying to understand something real. The something real at the center of all this testimony might be the Philadelphia experiment as described. It might be a powerful but conventional electromagnetic experiment that had unusual effects on the people involved. It might be the ordinary strangeness of wartime service on a new and untested vessel. It might be the psychological residue of being asked to do classified work without being told what it was or why. Or it might be all of those things together, layered on top of each other in ways that make them impossible to separate after 80 years. The voices do not resolve into a picture, they resolve into an atmosphere. And the atmosphere says, something happened here that some of the people involved could not entirely account for. Whether that something is what Allende said it was, we have not established. We have not established it yet. But we are not done looking. Somewhere between invisibility and teleportation, the story changed shape. It is worth paying attention to when that happened and why, because the shift is not arbitrary. It did not occur because new evidence emerged suggesting the ship had moved through space. It occurred because the story needed somewhere to go. Invisibility, as a claim, had been examined and questioned and pushed against until its edges were fairly well defined. The physics had been discussed. The crew testimony had been gathered. The official denials had been issued and analyzed. And the story was still alive, still moving, still pulling researchers and believers and skeptics into its orbit. But it needed expansion to keep doing that. It needed a new layer. Teleportation provided that layer. And then time provided another one. The original Allende letters described a ship that vanished from view. That was the core claim. Optical invisibility, the vessel becoming undetectable to the human eye through the application of powerful electromagnetic fields. The teleportation element entered the story gradually, through a process of accretion that is fairly characteristic of how conspiracy theories develop over time. Someone added a detail. Another researcher built on that detail. A book included it as an established part of the narrative. Later writers treated it as foundational. The specific claim that emerged was that the Eldridge had not only become invisible, but had been physically transported from the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard to the Norfolk Naval Station in Virginia, a distance of roughly 250 miles, and had reappeared there briefly before returning to Philadelphia. The entire event was said to have taken a matter of minutes. Allende's original letters are ambiguous on this point. He described the ship vanishing and reappearing. Whether he meant optical vanishing or physical displacement is not entirely clear in his original text. The teleportation interpretation was not simply present in his letters. It was read into them, and then read back onto them as if it had been there from the beginning. This kind of retrospective clarification is common in stories that develop over time. The original source gets reinterpreted in light of later additions, and the original source, which cannot speak for itself, gets recruited as evidence for claims that were actually added later. But the teleportation claim, once it was established, opened the door to something even more extraordinary. If the ship had moved instantaneously through space, the next question was whether it had also moved through time. The time displacement element of the Philadelphia experiment story is the most dramatic and the least grounded in anything resembling evidence. It is also, perhaps for that reason, the element that has proven most durable in popular culture. The 1984 film about the experiment centered on time travel. Subsequent books and documentaries treated it as a serious possibility. It became the version of the story that most people who are not deeply familiar with the details actually know. It is worth being honest about where this came from. The time element was introduced primarily through the work of Al Bielek, who has already been discussed and dismissed as a credible source. His claims about traveling to the future and back were not supported by any documentary evidence, were internally inconsistent, and were contradicted by his own earlier accounts. The time travel version of the Philadelphia experiment is, in its most developed form, essentially Bielek's personal mythology attached to a pre-existing story. That is not the end of the discussion, though. Because while Bielek is not credible, the question of whether the United States government was seriously investigating time-related phenomena in the 1940s and beyond is a different question, and it has a more complicated answer. In 1943, a classified research program was initiated under the direction of a physicist named John von Neumann. Von Neumann was one of the most brilliant mathematicians and physicists of the 20th century, a man whose contributions to computer science, quantum mechanics, and game theory were foundational. He was also deeply involved in classified government research during and after the war. The program he directed, according to certain declassified documents and the accounts of researchers who investigated it, was examining the theoretical basis for manipulating the relationship between electromagnetic fields and the structure of spacetime. This program is sometimes referred to as the Phoenix Project, and it is where the Philadelphia experiment story and a separate body of claims about government time research begin to merge. The Phoenix Project claims are extensive and mostly unverifiable. They involve research at Montauk Air Force Station in New York, experiments with time portals, the development of technology capable of creating localized distortions in the spacetime continuum, and a range of other claims that extend far into territory that mainstream physics does not recognize. The researchers most associated with these claims, Preston Nichols and Peter Moon, published a series of books beginning in the late 1980s that became influential in certain circles. They claimed to have direct knowledge of the Montauk experiments. They claimed personal involvement. They claimed recovered memories of experiences that had been suppressed. The credibility problems with Nichols and Moon are significant. Their accounts contain the same kinds of internal inconsistencies and unverifiable claims that characterize Bielek's testimony. Their version of events expanded continuously over the years, adding new elements and new connections in ways that followed the logic of storytelling rather than the logic of memory or investigation. And yet, von Neumann was real. His involvement in classified wartime research was real. The general question of whether strong electromagnetic fields could produce effects on the local structure of spacetime was, as has already been discussed, a genuine theoretical question that serious physicists were examining in that period. The connection between the documented and the undocumented here is suggestive without being probative. Von Neumann's name in the story lends it a credibility it would not otherwise have, but his name being in the story does not make the story true. There is a documented government program that is relevant to this discussion, and it is not the Phoenix Project. In 1943, the same year as the alleged Philadelphia experiment, the Office of Naval Research commissioned a study into the theoretical basis for radar invisibility. This is documented. The study examined whether it was possible to make a vessel undetectable to radar through means beyond standard camouflage and structural design. It considered electromagnetic field configurations that might absorb or deflect radar signals. The study apparently concluded that the theoretical basis was limited and the practical challenges were enormous, and it was not pursued aggressively, but it existed. It was real research conducted by real physicists, examining a question that was adjacent to the question the Philadelphia experiment was supposedly answering. Adjacent is not the same as identical. Radar invisibility and optical invisibility are different problems. But the research culture that would commission a study into one would not necessarily find the other unthinkable. the relationship between the Philadelphia experiment and time becomes slightly less purely speculative when you consider what relativistic physics actually says about the relationship between electromagnetic fields and time. General relativity predicts that strong gravitational fields slow the passage of time. This is not speculation. It is a measured, confirmed, experimentally verified prediction of a well-tested theory. GPS satellites have to correct for this effect because time passes slightly faster for them than for clocks on the surface of the Earth, due to the difference in gravitational field strength. If unified field theory had been completed, and if it described a genuine coupling between electromagnetic fields and spacetime geometry, then in principle, extremely strong electromagnetic fields might produce measurable effects on the local passage of time. Not time travel in the science fiction sense, something subtler. A slight dilation or compression of experienced time in the immediate vicinity of the field. The crew members who described disorientation and confusion might, on this theoretical basis, have been experiencing something like a mild temporal distortion, not being sent to the future, not jumping through time, but existing for a period in a local field that slightly disrupted their subjective experience of time's passage. This is highly speculative. It requires the same incomplete unified field theory that the invisibility claims require. It is not supported by any experimental evidence, but it is also not simply absurd. It follows from real physics in a way that most time travel claims do not. It is the kind of speculation that a physicist might entertain seriously for a few minutes before noting all the reasons it cannot be assessed without a theoretical framework that does not exist. The government programs that actually existed in the vicinity of these claims are worth examining because they are strange enough on their own terms. Project MKULTRA is the most well-known example of a classified government research program that turned out, when it was partially declassified in the 1970s, to be significantly stranger than most people had assumed possible. MKULTRA involved experiments on human subjects without their knowledge or consent, testing the effects of psychoactive drugs, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and various forms of psychological manipulation. It was run by the CIA and was active from the early 1950s through the late 1960s. When MKULTRA became public, the reaction of many people was that this was exactly the kind of thing they had suspected the government was doing, but had been told was paranoid fantasy. The revelation did not prove that every conspiracy theory was true, but it established, beyond any reasonable doubt, that the government was willing to conduct secret experiments on human beings using techniques that would be considered deeply unethical by any normal standard, and that it was capable of maintaining that secrecy for decades. MKULTRA is relevant to the Philadelphia experiment not because it involves the same kind of research, but because it establishes the institutional character of the agencies involved. An institution that runs MKULTRA is an institution that has demonstrated a specific kind of relationship to ethics, to secrecy, and to the human beings it considers available for experimentation. The Office of Naval Research and the agencies adjacent to the Philadelphia experiment story were different organizations from the CIA. But they operated in the same general culture of classified wartime and Cold War research. They had the same relationship to secrecy. They had the same institutional incentives to protect programs that had gone wrong. Project MKNAOMI, less well known than MKULTRA, was a related program that involved biological research and was even more thoroughly buried in the official record. It surfaced only partially in declassifications and is still not fully public. Project Artichoke, which preceded MKULTRA, explored whether human subjects could be made to perform actions they would not consciously consent to through a combination of hypnosis, drugs, and psychological manipulation. These programs are not the Philadelphia experiment, but they are the context in which the Philadelphia experiment allegedly occurred. They are the water in which the story swims, and the water is demonstrably strange. There is a specific declassified document from the early 1950s that researchers have pointed to in connection with the time displacement question. It is a naval research memorandum that discusses, in abstract terms, the theoretical basis for what it calls temporal reference frame manipulation. The document is real. It is in the National Archives. Researchers have read it and cited it. What it actually says is less dramatic than its reputation suggests. It discusses temporal reference frames in the context of navigational systems and the precise measurement of time for synchronization purposes. It is concerned with clocks and their accuracy under various conditions, not with sending ships through time. But the phrase temporal reference frame manipulation appears in a naval research document from the early 1950s. And once a phrase like that exists in a document, in a context adjacent to classified electromagnetic research, it becomes very difficult to stop it from being interpreted in ways that its authors almost certainly did not intend. This is a recurring pattern in the research around the Philadelphia experiment. Real documents with real but mundane content get placed in proximity to extraordinary claims, and the proximity does work that the documents themselves cannot support. The document becomes evidence not for what it says, but for what it is near. That is not a legitimate form of evidence. But it is a very human form of reasoning. We make meaning from proximity. We find connections in adjacency. We tell ourselves stories about what is near what, and the stories feel like understanding even when they are not. The time displacement question, stripped of its most dramatic elements, reduces to something like this. The United States government was conducting classified electromagnetic research in the 1940s. That research touched on theoretical questions about the relationship between electromagnetic fields and the structure of spacetime. Those theoretical questions, if fully answered, might have implications for the local behavior of time in the vicinity of strong fields. Whether any of that research was ever applied to a vessel in a harbor in Philadelphia in 1943 remains unknown. Whether the crew members who described unusual experiences were encountering real physical phenomena or the ordinary disorientation of stressed men doing difficult work under classified conditions remains unknown. The time travel version of the Philadelphia experiment is almost certainly false. The version in which something unusual happened that had something to do with electromagnetic fields and that produced effects on the crew that nobody fully understood, that version has not been closed. It remains open the way a lot of things from that period remain open. Not because the evidence supports it definitively, but because the evidence against it is not complete and the research culture of the era was genuinely strange enough that the claim cannot be dismissed simply because it is strange. The strangeness of the era is not the story. But it is the container the story lives in, and containers matter. They shape what can be held inside them. What was held inside the research programs of the 1940s fully is something we still do not know completely. Probably we never will. The experiments that failed. The results that were buried. The men who came back changed and could not say from what. Some of those things are in the record now. Others are not. And the Philadelphia experiment lives in the space between the things that made it into the record and the things that did not. That space is real, even if what fills it is uncertain. There is a particular kind of person who spends years investigating something that official history says did not happen. They are not all the same. That is the first thing to understand about them. The image of the lone obsessive, wallpapered room and red string connecting newspaper clippings is a caricature that flattens something more varied and more human. Some of the people who devoted significant portions of their lives to the Philadelphia experiment were genuinely rigorous. Some were not. Some started rigorous and became less so as the years accumulated and the answers did not come. Some started credulous and became more careful as the evidence pushed back against their assumptions. What they shared was not a conclusion. It was a question they could not put down. That quality, the inability to put a question down, is worth examining on its own terms before getting into the specific individuals, because it tells you something about the nature of the story itself, about what kind of thing it is, and why it has the grip it has. Most unsolved mysteries lose investigators over time. The energy dissipates. People move on. The absence of resolution becomes a kind of resolution in itself, a settling into the acknowledgement that this particular question is not going to be answered, and that life contains other things worth attending to. The Philadelphia experiment did not work that way. It kept people, decades in some cases, entire research careers oriented around something that could not be confirmed and would not be dismissed. Why? Morris Jessup has already been discussed as the man who received Allen's first letters. But his relationship to the story deserves more careful attention than it has received so far, because Jessup was not simply a passive recipient of extraordinary claims. He was a person with his own investment in the idea that the official version of physical reality was incomplete. Jessup had trained as a scientist. He had done legitimate astronomical work. He had a mind that was genuinely calibrated for careful observation and careful reasoning. And he had, by the mid-1950s, developed a conviction that the phenomena being reported as UFOs were not explainable within the conventional frameworks of either psychology or physics, and that the official dismissal of those reports was not honest. That conviction preceded Allen's letters. When the letters arrived, they did not create Jessup's interest in hidden knowledge. They arrived into an interest that was already there, already organized, already looking for evidence that the world was stranger than the official version admitted. This matters because it means Jessup was not a neutral evaluator of Allen's claims. He was a person predisposed to find them significant, not necessarily credulous, but oriented. The question he was already asking made Allen's answer feel more relevant than it might have to someone who was not already asking it. That predisposition does not make Jessup wrong. People who are already asking the right question are sometimes the ones who recognize the right answer when it appears. But it does mean that his engagement with the Philadelphia experiment story was not purely evidential. It was also personal. It confirmed something he was already inclined to believe. His death in 1959 cut off what might have been a more developed investigation. People who knew him said he was closer to something in the final months than he had been before. Whether that something was a genuine breakthrough in understanding or a deepening of confusion that had become unbearable is not something the available record can determine. Charles Berlitz is a more complicated figure in the story's investigative history. Berlitz was already famous when he co-authored the 1979 book on the Philadelphia experiment with William Moore. His previous book on the Bermuda Triangle had been a massive commercial success, selling millions of copies and introducing the concept of the Bermuda Triangle to a worldwide audience. He was a skilled popular writer with a talent for presenting extraordinary claims in accessible, compelling prose. He was not primarily a rigorous researcher. His Bermuda Triangle book was criticized extensively by scientists and investigators who pointed out that many of the disappearances it described had conventional explanations that Berlitz had not mentioned, that some of the incidents he cited had been embellished or were inaccurate, and that the book's central thesis was not supported by the evidence it presented. The same criticisms applied to the Philadelphia experiment book, though with somewhat more justification for the claims made. The book was better researched than the Bermuda Triangle work, partly because Moore was a more careful investigator than Berlitz's previous collaborators, but it still treated uncertain claims with more confidence than the evidence warranted. What the Berlitz book did was bring the Philadelphia experiment to an audience of millions who would never have encountered it through the small press publications and researcher newsletters in which it had previously circulated. It transformed the story from an underground phenomenon into a mainstream one. It created the popular version of the experiment that most people who have heard of it actually know. That popularization had consequences. It attracted more researchers, which was useful. It also attracted more credulous believers and more sensationalist interpreters, which was less useful. The story that emerged in the popular consciousness after the Berlitz book was larger and louder and less careful than the story that had developed slowly over the previous 2 decades. William Moore is the more interesting figure of that collaboration, and also the more troubled one. Moore was a genuine investigator. He did real legwork. He filed real information requests. He found real documents and real people and real inconsistencies in the official record. His contribution to the Philadelphia experiment research was substantive in ways that Berlitz's was not. But Moore also became, in the years after the Philadelphia experiment book, increasingly entangled with sources whose reliability was questionable and whose motives were unclear. He became involved in the broader UFO research community, where he developed relationships with people who claimed to be government insiders leaking classified information. The most significant of these claimed insiders led Moore into a series of investigations that eventually produced results that were embarrassing to him professionally. In 1989, Moore gave a speech at a major UFO research conference in which he admitted that he had been working with a group of individuals he believed to be government operatives, that he had been passing information to them and receiving information from them, and that he was not certain what their actual agenda had been. He said he had convinced himself that cooperating with them was a way of getting access to real classified information. He acknowledged that this had compromised his objectivity and possibly his integrity. The speech was remarkable for its honesty. It was also devastating to his credibility as a researcher. The question of whether his earlier work on the Philadelphia experiment, conducted before his involvement with these individuals, was tainted by the same problems, is one that researchers have debated. The general consensus is that the Philadelphia experiment book was his most careful work, and that its core research was not significantly compromised by his later associations. But the shadow fell backward anyway. Once a researcher's credibility is damaged in one area, everything they touched gets re-examined. That is not always fair, but it is how institutional credibility works. There is a researcher whose name appears less often in popular accounts of the Philadelphia experiment, but who represents perhaps the most methodologically serious engagement with the story. Jacques Vallée is a French-American scientist and computer scientist who has also spent decades investigating UFO phenomena and related anomalies. He has a background in astrophysics and computer science that gives him a different set of analytical tools than most researchers who have engaged with this material. He is not credulous. He is also not dismissive. He occupies a position that is unusual in this field, taking the phenomena seriously as phenomena while remaining genuinely skeptical about the explanations offered for them. Valley examined the Philadelphia experiment evidence in some depth and reached conclusions that were neither a full endorsement nor a full dismissal. He found the core claim implausible in the form in which it had been presented. He found the documentary record insufficient to support the specific claims about the Eldridge. But he also found the research culture of the era and the specific electromagnetic research programs that were conducted during the war interesting enough that he did not think the subject deserved the contempt that mainstream science tended to direct at it. His position was roughly this: something unusual was probably attempted. What was attempted was probably much less dramatic than the legend describes. The legend grew around a real kernel, the way legends tend to, accumulating detail and drama over time until the kernel was no longer visible beneath what had been added to it. That is a measured position. It is not satisfying to either believers or skeptics, which is probably a sign that it is reasonably honest. The people who investigated this story paid a price that is worth acknowledging, not always a dramatic price. Not always a career-ending price, though sometimes it was that, more often a quieter cost. The cost of being associated with something that mainstream institutions treated as not serious. The cost of having your name appear in the same sentence as Carlos Allende and Alfred Bielek and the annotated margins of a UFO researcher's book. The cost of being the person at a professional gathering who everyone knows spent years looking into the Philadelphia experiment. Science and academia have formal and informal systems for marking certain areas of inquiry as legitimate and others as not. The formal systems involve peer review and publication standards and research funding. The informal systems involve reputation and social capital, and the particular kind of dismissal that gets directed at people who are seen as having gone native in the territory of the credulous. Researchers who engaged seriously with the Philadelphia experiment found themselves on the wrong side of both systems. Even if their methodology was careful, even if their conclusions were measured, the subject matter itself carried a stigma that attached to them regardless of what they actually said about it. Some handled this by becoming more aggressive in their claims, leaning into the stigma rather than trying to escape it. If you are going to be dismissed as a crank, the logic goes, you might as well say something that justifies the dismissal. This is a self-defeating response, but it is a human one. Others handled it by becoming increasingly private about their research, sharing findings only within small communities of people who were already interested, publishing in venues that mainstream institutions did not take seriously. This protected them from the worst of the professional consequences, but also limited the reach of whatever they had actually found. A few tried to maintain the dual identity of serious researcher and unconventional investigator, publishing careful work in mainstream venues while also pursuing Philadelphia experiment research in private. This worked for a while for some of them and did not work at all for others. There is something worth saying about what sustained these researchers across years of investigation that produced no definitive resolution. Part of it was the genuine strangeness of the available evidence. Not the dramatic strangeness of ships vanishing and crew members traveling through time. The quieter strangeness of a research culture that demonstrably attempted unusual things, of official records that had gaps in places where you would not expect gaps, of crew members who said less than they knew or less than they seemed to know. That genuine strangeness was real fuel. It kept questions open that should perhaps have closed. It provided enough material to keep an investigation feeling productive even when the central claims could not be confirmed. But part of it was also something more personal. Something about what the Philadelphia experiment meant to the people who could not stop investigating it. The story is, at its core, a story about the possibility that the world is more than what we are officially told, that powerful institutions have done things that they have not acknowledged, that the boundaries of what is scientifically possible are not where official science places them, that ordinary people, merchant seamen and civilian contractors, and junior Navy personnel witnessed things that their government chose to bury rather than explain. That is a story with an emotional resonance that goes beyond the specific claims about a specific ship in a specific harbor. It is a story about power and secrecy, and the experience of knowing something that the people in charge of the official record have decided you do not know. For people who had their own reasons to feel that official knowledge was incomplete or deliberately distorted, the Philadelphia experiment was not just an interesting historical puzzle. It was a kind of evidence for a worldview. Evidence that the gap between what is officially true and what is actually true can be enormous, and that the people who populate that gap are not always wrong. That investment is not evidence for the experiment, but it is evidence for why the experiment has the hold it has. Why it kept researchers across decades. Why it is still being discussed now. There is a researcher who spent nearly 30 years working on the Philadelphia experiment and who, near the end of his life, gave an interview that has been quoted in various forms in subsequent discussions. He said he had spent those decades trying to determine whether something real had been buried or whether he had been chasing a sophisticated fiction. He said that after all that time, he still did not know. He said the evidence was exactly as ambiguous at the end of his investigation as it had been at the beginning, which he found both frustrating and somehow fitting. He said the story had taught him something that was not about the Navy or about electromagnetic physics. It had taught him that the boundary between what happened and what people believe happened is not always where we assume it is, that the two categories are not cleanly separate. That belief shapes what is remembered, and memory shapes what is believed, and neither of them is a pure record of what occurred. He said he thought something had happened in Philadelphia in 1943. He was not certain it was the experiment. He was not certain it was anything as dramatic as the legend described, but he thought the story had not grown from nothing. He thought there was a root somewhere beneath the accumulated layers of embellishment and misremembering and deliberate fabrication. He could not find the root. After 30 years, he could not find it. He seemed at peace with that, which is either wisdom or exhaustion, or some particular combination of the two that long investigations tend to produce in the people who conduct them. His name is not important here. What is important is that he was real, and that he spent real years on this, and that the question he was asking was real even if the answer never came. The question does not require a believer to be worth asking. It only requires honesty about what we know and what we do not, and the patience to sit with the difference between those two things without forcing a resolution that the evidence cannot support. That patience is rarer than it should be. The researchers who had it, regardless of what they concluded, were doing something genuinely valuable. The United States was not the only country doing strange things in the 1940s. That sentence sounds obvious when you say it plainly. Of course it was not. The Second World War was a global conflict involving dozens of nations, and the pressure to develop technological advantages was not uniquely American. Every major power was running research programs, some of them openly and some of them in conditions of extreme secrecy, and the ones that remained secret longest are by definition the ones we know least about. But the Philadelphia experiment story has always been told as an American story. It's a Navy story, a story rooted in one harbor, one ship, one research culture. And that framing, while understandable, leaves out a context that changes how the story feels when you look at it from a wider angle. Because what the Americans were doing, or possibly doing, in Philadelphia in 1943 was not happening in isolation. Other governments were asking similar questions, running similar experiments, pushing against similar edges of what physics and engineering could be persuaded to attempt under wartime pressure. Some of those programs have been partially declassified. Some of them are strange enough that the Philadelphia experiment, placed alongside them, looks less like an outlier and more like one data point in a broader pattern. The German research programs of the Second World War have been extensively studied and extensively mythologized, and separating the documented from the invented requires some care. What is documented is that Nazi Germany ran a significant number of highly classified research programs under the general umbrella of what historians have called the Wonder Weapons effort. These were programs aimed at developing technologies that could reverse the course of a war that was going increasingly badly for Germany. Some of them produced real results. The V-1 and V-2 rockets were real. The jet aircraft were real. The early nerve agents were real and deeply disturbing. Others were more speculative. There is documented evidence of German research into electromagnetic weapons, into the possibility of using high-frequency electromagnetic fields to disrupt enemy equipment and personnel. There was research into what German scientists called the death ray, which sounds like science fiction, but was being pursued with genuine institutional resources by people with real physics training. The Bell, or Die Glocke, is the German program that comes up most often in discussions adjacent to the Philadelphia experiment. The bell was allegedly a device, roughly bell-shaped, that generated powerful rotating electromagnetic or possibly gravitational fields, and that was being developed for purposes that researchers have never fully agreed on. Some accounts suggest it was a propulsion system. Others suggest it was a weapon. Others suggest it was something more exotic, an attempt to manipulate space or time or both. The documentary evidence for the bell is thin and contested. The primary source is a Polish researcher and journalist named Igor Witkowski, who claimed to have had access to transcripts of a post-war interrogation of an SS general that described the device in detail. The transcripts themselves have never been made fully public, and their authenticity has been questioned. What is more securely documented is that Germany was conducting significant electromagnetic field research during the war, that some of this research was classified at the highest levels, and that a substantial portion of the relevant records were destroyed or lost in the final months of the war and the immediate aftermath. The parallel with the Philadelphia experiment is not exact, but it is real. Two major powers on opposite sides of a catastrophic conflict were apparently pursuing research into the military applications of powerful electromagnetic fields, and both programs left behind records that are incomplete in ways that make full reconstruction impossible. The Soviet Union's wartime and post-war research programs are even harder to assess than the German ones, for the obvious reason that Soviet archives remained inaccessible to Western researchers for decades and are still not fully open. What has emerged from partial declassification and from the accounts of scientists who worked in the Soviet system and later emigrated suggests a research culture that was in some ways more willing to pursue unconventional ideas than the Western scientific establishment. The Soviet interest in what they called psychotronic research, the investigation of unusual human capabilities and their possible military applications, is documented and was taken seriously at the highest levels of the Soviet scientific and military establishment for a significant period. Remote viewing, psychokinesis, the influence of electromagnetic fields on human consciousness and behavior, these were not fringe interests in the Soviet research culture of the Cold War era. They were funded programs with institutional backing. The connection to the Philadelphia experiment is indirect but worth noting. The Soviet programs shared with the alleged American experiment a willingness to investigate the intersection of electromagnetic fields and human consciousness, and a willingness to do so in conditions of extreme secrecy. The Soviet researchers who worked in these areas described, in accounts that became available after the Soviet Union's collapse, experiencing results that they found difficult to explain within conventional frameworks, and that their superiors were unwilling to make public. Some of those results involved subjects reporting unusual sensory experiences in the presence of strong electromagnetic fields. Some involved apparent effects on memory and perception that the researchers could not fully account for. The specific phenomena described do not map neatly onto the Philadelphia experiment claims, but they occupy the same general territory. Britain's wartime research programs are better documented than most, partly because of the culture of post-war disclosure that produced memoirs and official histories, and partly because some programs were declassified earlier than their American equivalents. The British were conducting significant research into radar and countermeasures during the war, much of which involved the behavior of electromagnetic fields in ways that occasionally pushed into theoretical territory. The Telecommunications Research Establishment, which handled much of this work, employed some of the best physicists in Britain and operated under conditions of intense secrecy. What is interesting from the perspective of the Philadelphia experiment story is a program that ran in the early 1940s investigating what British researchers called electromagnetic camouflage. The program was examining whether it was possible to use electromagnetic fields to make aircraft harder to detect, not just by radar, but potentially by other means. The theoretical basis for the research drew on the same electromagnetic physics that underlies the Philadelphia experiment claims. The program apparently concluded fairly quickly that the practical challenges were too significant for the available technology and was not pursued beyond initial theoretical work. But its existence confirms that the general question being asked in the Philadelphia experiment narrative was not being asked only by the Americans, and not only by one eccentric merchant seaman writing letters in different colored inks. It was a question that multiple sophisticated research establishments were asking, with varying levels of seriousness and varying levels of resources, in the same general period. Japan's wartime research programs have received less attention in Western discussions of unusual Second World War science than the German or American programs, partly because of language barriers, and partly because a significant portion of the relevant records were destroyed in the final stages of the Pacific War. What has been reconstructed suggests that Japanese military research included programs into biological and chemical weapons that were among the most brutal of the war, which is a different kind of strangeness from electromagnetic invisibility, but is relevant to the general question of what governments were willing to attempt under wartime conditions. There is less documented evidence of Japanese research into electromagnetic field manipulation of the kind relevant to the Philadelphia experiment. But the general willingness to pursue unconventional and ethically unrestrained research was, if anything, more pronounced in the Japanese military research establishment than in the American or British ones. The point is not that the Philadelphia experiment was typical of wartime research. It was not, even if it happened. The point is that the research culture of the era was characterized by a willingness to attempt things that would be considered reckless or unethical in peacetime, and that this willingness was not uniquely American. It was a feature of the entire wartime scientific establishment across multiple nations. That context does not prove the experiment occurred, but it does make the claim that such an experiment would have been attempted somewhat more plausible than it would be if the Philadelphia experiment were evaluated against the standards of peacetime research ethics. There is a post-war program that deserves specific attention because it connects the wartime research culture to the Cold War period in ways that are directly relevant to the Philadelphia experiment story. Operation Paperclip is documented and declassified. It was a program run by the United States government in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, in which American agencies recruited German scientists, including some who had worked on classified weapons programs under the Nazi regime, and brought them to the United States to work on American research programs. The program was controversial from the beginning. Some of the scientists recruited had been members of the SS. Some had used slave labor in their research programs. The ethical compromises involved were significant and were acknowledged to varying degrees by the people who ran the program, who believed that the strategic value of the scientists outweighed the ethical costs. The scientists who came to the United States under Operation Paperclip brought with them knowledge of German research programs, including programs that had been classified and whose records had been partially destroyed. Some of them were integrated into naval research programs. Some of them worked on electromagnetic research. Some of them were at institutions that had connections to the research culture in which the Philadelphia experiment was allegedly being conducted. This is not a direct connection to the experiment. The timing is wrong for Paperclip scientists to have been involved in a 1943 experiment, since Paperclip began at the end of the war in 1945. But it is relevant to the broader question of what knowledge about unusual electromagnetic research was circulating in American military and scientific institutions in the late 1940s and early 1950s, which is the period when the Philadelphia experiment story first began to develop. Some researchers have speculated that the story, or elements of it, might have originated in knowledge brought to the United States by Paperclip scientists. Knowledge of German research into electromagnetic field effects that had not been fully replicated in American programs, but that informed the theoretical framework of what American researchers were attempting. This is speculative. There is no documented connection between specific Paperclip scientists and specific aspects of the Philadelphia experiment narrative. But the channel existed, and knowledge moved through it in ways that are not fully mapped. The broader pattern that emerges from looking at parallel programs across multiple nations is something worth sitting with. Multiple governments, operating independently and under different institutional structures, arrived at similar research questions in the 1940s and 1950s. The questions involved electromagnetic fields, their interaction with physical matter, their potential effects on human perception and consciousness, and the possibility of using them for military purposes that went beyond the conventional. Some of these programs produced results that were acknowledged and became part of the public scientific record. Others produced results that were classified and have only partially emerged. Others produced nothing documentable and were quietly closed. The Philadelphia experiment fits structurally into this pattern, whether or not it happened in the specific form described. The question it represents, whether powerful electromagnetic fields could be used to make a vessel undetectable, was a real question being asked by real researchers in a real wartime context. The claim that the answer was found, tested, and then buried is extraordinary. But the claim that the question was being seriously asked is not extraordinary at all. There is one more parallel program worth discussing, and it is perhaps the most directly relevant to the Philadelphia experiment in terms of its focus and its methods. In the 1950s and 1960s, the United States Navy conducted a series of experiments under the general heading of Project Squid and related programs, examining the behavior of plasma, ionized gas, in strong magnetic fields. Some of these experiments involved the generation of electromagnetic fields of significant intensity around metallic structures and the measurement of various effects produced. The results of some of these experiments have been partially declassified. What has been released is, on the surface, unremarkable. Measurements of field strengths, observations of plasma behavior, technical data about the interaction of ionized gas with magnetic fields. But some researchers who examined the released documents noted that certain data sets appeared to have been redacted in ways that were unusual. Not just the blacking out of classified information, which is standard in declassified documents, something more systematic, specific numerical results removed, specific observational notes excised, in patterns that suggested the removed content was not simply names or operational details, but actual experimental findings. What those findings were, nobody outside the relevant agencies knows. The redactions are not explained. The justification for their continued classification, if they are still classified, has not been made public. They may be nothing. They may be routine data that was redacted for reasons that have more to do with bureaucratic caution than with any extraordinary content. That is probably the most likely explanation, but they are there. In documents that touch on electromagnetic field research conducted by the Navy in the period after the alleged Philadelphia experiment, and their presence, in redacted form, in documents that are otherwise fairly mundane, is one more piece of the pattern that surrounds this story without quite completing it. The picture that emerges from all of this, from the German programs and the Soviet programs and the British research and Operation Paperclip and the post-war naval experiments, is not a picture that confirms the Philadelphia experiment. It is a picture that places the Philadelphia experiment in a world where such an experiment would not have been unthinkable. A world where multiple sophisticated nations were pushing against the edges of what electromagnetic physics could do. It was a world where results that seemed too strange or too dangerous were buried rather than published. A world where the official record of what was attempted is demonstrably incomplete. That world is real. It is documented. It is the world in which the Philadelphia experiment was allegedly attempted. And it is the world in which we have been trying to understand what actually happened. With the tools available to people who were not in the room and were not given access to the records, and have had to piece together a picture from fragments and gaps, and the accounts of people who may or may not have been telling the truth about what they saw. The fragments do not assemble into certainty. They assemble into a question that is still open, in a world that was strange enough to make that openness feel like honesty rather than failure. That is where we are, and there is one more place to go. Some questions do not resolve. That is not a failure of the investigation. It is not a failure of the investigators. It is not even necessarily a failure of the historical record, though the record is certainly incomplete. It is simply a feature of certain kinds of events, certain kinds of stories, that they resist the closure we bring to them because the closure we bring is not adequate to what they actually are. The Philadelphia experiment is one of those stories. We have moved through it slowly. We have looked at the ship and the harbor and the man who started the story and the institution that denied it, and the physics that might or might not underlie it, and the crew members who spoke, and the ones who did not, and the researchers who could not let it go, and the world of parallel strangeness in which it was embedded. We have tried to be honest about what the evidence supports and what it does not. We have tried not to force a conclusion that the material cannot bear. And here we are, at the end, without a verdict. That is the right place to be. Let us say what can honestly be said. The USS Eldridge was a real ship. The Philadelphia Naval Shipyard was a real place. The year 1943 was a real year in which the United States Navy was conducting real research into the electromagnetic properties of its vessels, research that was classified and that went beyond simple degaussing in ways that are not fully documented in the public record. Carlos Allende was a real person who claimed to have witnessed something extraordinary and who spent the rest of his life in the complicated position of someone who cannot be fully believed and cannot be fully dismissed. He was not reliable in the conventional sense. He was also not simply a fabricator. Whatever he was specific enough and persistent enough and internally consistent enough in certain ways that the people who wanted to dismiss him entirely found the dismissal harder than it should have been. The Navy's official denial has been consistent and categorical and supported by documentary evidence that cannot be fully trusted because all documentary evidence of classified programs is subject to the same fundamental problem. which is that the institution maintaining the record is the institution being asked about. The physics underlying the experiment as described does not work within our current understanding of electromagnetism and gravity. The theoretical framework that might make it work, Einstein's unified field theory, was never completed and remains incomplete. The scientific culture of the era was genuinely unusual in ways that make the attempt, if not the success, more plausible than it would otherwise be. The crew testimony is fragmentary, filtered through decades, and through the particular distortions that wartime secrecy and post-war silence impose on memory. Some of it feels genuinely strange. Some of it is clearly unreliable. The line between those two categories is not always clear. The researchers who investigated were human beings with human motivations and human limitations. Some of them did careful work. Some of them did not. All of them were shaped by the story in ways that affected what they were willing to see. That is what can honestly be said. What cannot be said, and what this account has tried not to say, is that the experiment definitely happened, or that it definitely did not. Both of those positions require certainty that the evidence does not provide. The definite believer and the definite skeptic are making the same fundamental error, which is treating an ambiguous situation as though it were resolved when it is not. The ambiguity is real. It is not a failure to have reached a conclusion. It is an accurate representation of where the evidence actually leaves us. There is a kind of intellectual honesty that consists of being willing to say, "I do not know," and mean it. Not as a hedge, not as a way of avoiding commitment, but as a genuine description of the epistemic situation. The Philadelphia experiment sits in the category of things about which I do not know is the honest answer, and anyone who tells you otherwise is either in possession of information they have not shared or is claiming a confidence they have not earned. But something happened. That phrase is less certain than it sounds. Something always happened. The question is what? Something happened in the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard in the fall of 1943. Ships were there. Sailors were there. Research was being conducted. Electromagnetic equipment was being installed and operated. People were doing classified work and being told not to discuss it. Whether among those things was an experiment that attempted optical invisibility, whether that experiment produced results, whether those results were what Allende described or something quite different, whether the effects on the crew were what the legend claims or something more mundane, all of that remains unknown. What is known is that a story emerged from that time and place that has not died in 80 years. And stories that do not die usually have a root. The root may be small. The root may not look much like the tree that grew from it. But there is almost always something there. The root of the Philadelphia experiment story might be a legitimate invisibility experiment that worked and was buried. It might be an electromagnetic experiment that failed in disturbing ways and was buried for that reason. It might be a degaussing program that had unexpected effects on the crew that nobody could explain, and that the Navy preferred not to have on the record. It might be something much simpler, a misperception or a set of misperceptions that a creative and troubled mind transformed into something extraordinary. All of those routes are possible. None of them is established. There is something worth saying about why we tell this kind of story. Not the Philadelphia experiment specifically. The category of story it belongs to, the story of the secret experiment, the hidden knowledge, the thing the government did that it will not acknowledge, the ordinary people who witnessed something that official history says did not happen. These stories serve a function. They are not just entertainment, though they are also that. They are a way of processing a real feature of the world, which is that powerful institutions do things in secret, and that the official record is not the complete record, and that the people who know that to be true sometimes have no way to prove it. The function is important. The processing is necessary. We live in a world where MKULTRA was real, where Operation Paperclip was real, where programs of extraordinary ethical ambiguity were conducted under conditions of extreme secrecy by institutions that publicly denied them for decades. The awareness that such things happen, the vigilance about the gap between official truth and actual truth, is not paranoia. It is a reasonable response to documented history. The Philadelphia experiment is partly a vehicle for that awareness. It holds open the possibility that official history is incomplete. It insists on the existence of the gap. It keeps asking the question that official institutions would prefer to have settled. Whether it is asking the question about the right event is less important, in a way, than the fact that it is asking it. The question is legitimate even if this particular instance turns out not to be. The harbor at night is quiet now, not the same harbor, not the same night. The Philadelphia Naval Shipyard that was the center of this story is not the place it was in 1943. It was decommissioned in 1996 after more than 2 centuries of operation. The land has been partially redeveloped. The specific section of the yard where the Eldridge was allegedly fitted for the experiment is not clearly marked. There is no monument to uncertainty there. There's no sign that says something may have happened here, and we are not entirely sure what. There is rarely a monument to uncertainty. We build monuments to things we know or think we know. The things we are not sure about tend not to get marked. But they remain in the landscape anyway, in the water, in the particular quality of light on a harbor surface at night, in the spaces between the things that are officially recorded. The USS Eldridge no longer exists as a physical object. It was scrapped in the late 1990s after its service in the Greek Navy. Whatever it carried in its hull, in its generators, in the electromagnetic equipment that was definitely installed on it and operated, is gone with it. The metal has been melted and reformed into other things. The ship that was at the center of this story for decades exists now only in documents and photographs and the memories of the people who served on it, most of whom are also gone. The story, though, is not gone with them. There is something in the structure of the Philadelphia experiment story that resembles the structure of a dream, not a nightmare, a dream, the kind that leaves a residue when you wake up, a feeling that something important happened even though the details are already dissolving. You remember fragments. A ship, a harbor, a light that should have been reflected but was not, men who were there and then were not there, or who were changed by whatever happened in ways that they could not fully articulate. The story has that quality of a partially remembered thing. It's not fully formed, not fully resolved, but carrying an emotional weight that does not depend on complete resolution. Dreams communicate in that mode. They operate through implication and atmosphere and the particular intensity of images that do not quite connect into a coherent narrative, but that leave you convinced, for a moment after waking, that you have understood something important. The Philadelphia experiment operates in that mode. Whatever the truth of it is, the story has that dream texture. It communicates something about the world, about power and secrecy, and the limits of what we can know. That does not depend on whether a ship actually vanished in a harbor in 1943. The communication is real even if the event is uncertain. Here is what the story finally is, when you strip away the layers of legend and embellishment and unreliable testimony and contested physics and official denial. It is a story about the experience of not being believed. Carlos Allende was a man who said he had seen something extraordinary and who was not believed, and who spent 40 years trying to make someone believe him, and who in the end was not sure himself whether what he had seen was what he said it was. Morris Jessup was a man who thought the official version of physical reality was incomplete, and who could not make the institutions of science take that seriously, and who died in circumstances that remain unclear. The crew members who spoke in careful and qualified ways about unusual equipment and unexplained experiences were people who had seen something they could not place within the available categories, and who, when they tried to describe it, were either dismissed or recruited into a legend that was larger than what they actually said. The researchers who spent years on this were people who believed that the gap between official truth and actual truth was real and significant and worth the cost of investigating, and who paid that cost without receiving the confirmation they were looking for. All of them were living inside the experience of knowing something, or believing they knew something, that the world around them was not prepared to acknowledge. That experience is not unique to the Philadelphia experiment. It is a recognizable human experience. The experience of the witness whose account does not fit the record. The experience of the investigator who cannot get the institution to engage honestly with what they have found. The experience of the person who says this happened and is told it did not and who cannot prove otherwise. The Philadelphia experiment story holds that experience in amber. It preserves it. It says to everyone who has ever been in that position, you are not alone, other people have been here. The gap is real even when you cannot prove what is on the other side of it. The rain has been falling through this whole story. soft and steady and indifferent to whether the ship disappeared or not. There is something about rain at night that makes the uncertain feel more bearable. It fills the silence without demanding anything from you. It says the world is still here, doing what it does, and you do not have to resolve everything tonight. The Philadelphia experiment will not be resolved tonight. It will probably not be resolved ever, not completely. The records that might settle it are either destroyed or still classified, or were never created in the first place. The people who were there are gone. The ship is gone. The specific moment in which something either happened or did not happen is 80 years in the past and receding. What remains is the story, and the question underneath the story, and the recognition that some questions are worth carrying even when they have no answers. Because the carrying of them is itself a form of attention to what the world might be, to what powerful institutions might do, to what ordinary people might witness, to what the distance between official truth and actual truth might contain. The Philadelphia experiment is not a solved mystery. It is not an unsolvable mystery either, not quite. It is a question that has been asked seriously by serious people for decades, and that has not yet received a serious answer from the institution that is in the best position to provide one. Maybe that answer exists somewhere in a filing system that has not been accessed. Maybe it exists in the memory of someone who has not been asked the right question. Maybe it exists in the equations that Einstein was working on in Princeton while, across the state, in a harbor, something may have been attempted that those equations could help explain. Or maybe the root of the story is smaller than all of that. Maybe it is a misperception and a troubled mind and a research culture that was strange enough to make the misperception feel credible. Maybe it is nothing more than that. The rain does not care which, and somehow at this hour, that is a comfort. The not knowing is the most honest place to rest, so rest there for now. The question will be here in the morning. Questions like this always are. Close your eyes. The harbor is dark and the ship is either there or it is not, and either way the water keeps moving and the rain keeps falling, and whatever happened in 1943 is finished now, whatever it was, and you are here and the world is quiet, and that is enough. That is enough.